Today's story is about a group of friends who travel to this supposedly haunted, abandoned town up in the mountains in Spain, and when they get there, the town totally lives up to the hype. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a grilled cheese sandwich, but make sure you blast it on super high heat so you just burn the outside of the bread, but don't melt the cheese. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of October 16th, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez bent down, pulled out his pocket knife, and he carefully cut through the stem of a mushroom that was growing right next to a mossy log. And then after freeing this mushroom, he put it inside of his wicker basket with the other mushrooms he had collected in the area. And then Enrique stood up and just took a minute to take in the unbelievable view of this lush green valley right below him. Enrique was out mushroom hunting along with his wife Anna and their two friends Jorge and Sofia, who were dating. And where they were mushroom hunting was near this old abandoned town called La Musara, which is located up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It had been Jorge's idea to come to this area and explore. Jorge had heard all these crazy stories about La Musara, about how it was haunted, and there was all this creepy folklore surrounding this town. As for Enrique, he didn't really care about the lore surrounding this town. Frankly, the town was not that interesting to him. What was interesting was the opportunity to come out here and collect mushrooms. That was something he really liked to do. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in this very busy port city in Spain called Tarragona, and so their lives day to day were very hectic. You know, Enrique, he worked at a bar as a bartender, and so every night he was surrounded by hundreds of people coming in and out. And so having a chance to come out here and be in nature at peace and collect these mushrooms just sounded too good to turn up. Enrique stopped staring at the valley right in front of him, and he turned around and continued to scan the mountainside for a particular type of mushroom that grew in this area. It was called the bloody milk cap, which was known to be great for grilling. You know, it paired well with meat. And so Enrique's plan was to go out on this mushroom hunting trip, and when they got back, he wanted to cook a feast using these mushrooms for his wife and his friends. The group slowly made their way uphill until they finally saw the outskirts of the abandoned town, La Musara. La Musara was more than 900 years old, and now it was just a collection of crumbling ruins, some dating back to prehistoric times. La Musara had never been a big town. At its peak, it had about 300 residents. But the last of the remaining residents of this town had finally fled 40 years earlier, and so now it was a ghost town. The group made their way over to one of the buildings that was right on the outer perimeter of La Musara. It was basically just a foundation with 3 walls still standing. There was no roof, but the friends, they went over to this building, and from right next to it, they were able to look straight down the main drag of La Musara. It was basically just a dirt road that went straight out, and all along the road were other kind of ruined foundations of where buildings used to be. And fairly far down this road, maybe 200 feet away from where all the friends were standing, was the center of La Musara, which was marked by this big church with a huge steeple, and the church was actually in decent shape. It had not totally crumbled onto itself like the rest of the buildings around it. And then behind the church, somewhat visible from where the friends were standing, was this overgrown cemetery. And then kind of off to the side of the church was this pond that was also very overgrown, and it was full of croaking frogs. Enrique and his friends just stood there next to their dilapidated building, staring at La Musara in silence. Now, they knew this place was going to be very creepy. You know, people had said it was haunted, and that was a big reason why Jorge wanted to come here. But now seeing it in person, I mean, really the creep factor was much higher than they expected. It really did look like a spooky place. And then adding to the spook factor was very clearly, as they were looking down this main road, the friends could see this mist kind of starting to envelop the town. Jorge had told the friends when he was doing his research about La Musara that the mist was really a trademark of this town, that at night it basically got completely consumed in white mist. But now the friends are looking down this road, it's the middle of the day, and already the mist is starting to come in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." And he grabbed his girlfriend Sophia's hand and he began kind of jogging down the main road in the direction of the church. And so Enrique and Anna followed behind. And after only walking maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique happened to turn around and look back where they had just been standing next to this dilapidated building. And already he couldn't see that building because this fog had rolled in and totally obscured his view. Enrique couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, again, because he thought the fog was supposed to come in at night, and it's broad daylight, and here we are, totally covered in fog, but he shook it off, thinking, what's the big deal? And so Enrique turned back around, and he and Anna hustled to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who by this point had stopped a little farther down the road, off to the side, where there was this strange rectangular rock that was maybe 2 feet tall, just kind of jutting up out of the ground. And when Enrique and Anna made it to Jorge and Sofia, Jorge placed his hand on the top of this strange rock, and looking very satisfied with himself, he would tell his friends, "This is the Sis Stone, and people say it contains dark powers." The Sis Stone was actually one of the oldest things in all of La Musara. Back in the day, Muslim armies used to march through La Musara, which actually got its name from this. La Musara means the place to march. And so these armies, as they would pass through La Musara, making their way to the valley down below, they would always stop at the Sis Stone because they believed it had magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in their upcoming battles. Now, the Muslim armies were long gone by this point, but the Sis Stone was still there, and people still said that it contained that kind of magical power, that there were dark forces at work inside of the stone, and so to touch it was very risky. In fact, some people said if you touched the Sis Stone, you could be sucked into this parallel world full of all these demonic entities. And so as Jorge told the group about all this history surrounding the Sis Stone and how no one should touch it, remember, he's got his hands squarely on the Sis Stone the whole time. And so when he finishes telling the story, he looks at the others and said, "Come on, somebody else touch it." Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, said, "Absolutely not. I'm not about to tempt evil spirits here." But Enrique's wife, Anna, said, "You know what? I'll touch it." And so Jorge smiled, he pulled his hand off the Sis Stone, and Anna, she walked forward, she took a deep breath, and then she placed her hand on the stone. And for a second, the whole group just held their breath, like something was going to reach out and grab Anna and pull her into the stone, but nothing happened, and a minute later, Anna had pulled her hand off, and the whole group was laughing. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique, who had been laughing along with the group, suddenly noticed that the frogs in the pond near the church, a little farther down the road from where they were suddenly so much louder. It was almost like when they touched the stone, it had maximized the volume of these frogs. And so Enrique, he turned his whole body and began staring down the road through the mist and fog at this pond, and he could kind of barely make it out. You know, he was trying to see if there was something obvious causing these frogs to kind of go crazy. But as he stared at this pond, which again he could barely see, right behind it was the church. But there was lots of fog kind of blocking the church, and for a second the fog kind of parted, and Enrique got a full shot of one of the windows of this abandoned church. And in the window was this dark figure just standing there staring at Enrique and his friends. And Enrique, he sees this thing in the window, and in a second it was gone. And then the fog rolled back in, covered up the window, and Enrique couldn't see anything anymore. And so Enrique just stood there in stunned silence, having no idea if what he just saw had really just happened or if it was in his imagination or something. But before he could even try to process what had just happened, he heard his name being called. And so he kind of snapped out of it, and he turned back to the group, and it was Anna, who was now jokingly saying, "Come on, Enrique, touch the stone too." Enrique quickly scanned Anna, Sofia, and Jorge's face, and they were all smiling and laughing still, and so clearly none of them had seen this figure in the window. And so Enrique, he kind of just looked at all of his friends, and then he looked back in the direction of the church and this window, which again he couldn't see because the fog was blocking it out. And so Enrique just tells himself, okay, there's no way that I just saw some dark figure moving around this abandoned church. You know, that must have been my imagination. I'm totally fine. And so he turned back to his friends, and he could tell they were not going to let it go until he touched this stone. And so he said, fine, and he walked up and he touched the stone. And immediately, as soon as his hand made contact with that stone, everything seemed to change. The air around Enrique got cooler, and the stone itself started to warm up. And as this happened, Enrique, whose hand was still on the stone, began to think, wow, I could do this for hours. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. I mean, this is amazing. But then somewhere buried deep in his mind, Enrique began telling himself, get away from the stone. Take your hand away, get away right now. And so finally, Enrique did yank his hand away, and right away, all those feelings he was having as he touched the stone disappeared. The air went back to normal. He did not feel compelled to touch the stone, and he just kind of was left thinking, what just happened? And so Enrique's wife, Ana, along with Jorge, they were both grinning at Enrique, waiting for him to tell them about what it was like to touch the cyst stone. But behind them, Sophia, Jorge's girlfriend, she was not happy. She was the only one who had not touched the cyst stone. And so she spoke up and said, guys, let's get away from the cyst stone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go. And so Jorge threw his arm around Sophia and told her to lighten up, and then said, come on, let's do some more exploring. And so Jorge took Sophia's hand, and he continued walking down the main road in the direction of the church, and Enrique's wife, Ana, she quickly followed right after them, kind of running to keep up, like she was a kid who was excited about what they were doing. But Enrique, he just stayed put for an extra second, because even though he had told himself that, whatever he saw in the window was nothing, he could not help the fact that as soon as he touched that cyst stone, he felt different. There was something off about the stone, and really there seemed to be something off about this whole village, which by this point was now completely enveloped in fog. They were totally covered. Now, Enrique, at this point, did just want to leave La Musara. He didn't want to be there anymore. The place was totally creeping him out. But he didn't want to be a party pooper, and so he turned and continued walking down the main road after his friends and his wife. And after he walked a little ways, the fog parted enough that he could see the pond full of these very loud croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he had seen or supposedly seen this dark figure, but the window was empty. And Enrique was relieved to see that his friends clearly had not stopped at the church. They had not tried to go in. They had gone behind the church into the cemetery. Enrique did not want to go inside of the church because even though, again, he had told himself that, that figure wasn't real, it wasn't really in the window, still there was a part of him that wanted to stay far away from this building. But after Enrique walked past the pond and began side-skirting the church to get to the cemetery, he just stopped and turned and actually faced the window, kind of like involuntarily. He was looking at the window where this dark figure had been. And again, it's empty, there's nothing there, but Enrique felt like something was pulling him towards this window. And so without saying anything to his friends, who weren't really paying attention to Enrique, they're kind of just walking around the cemetery, Enrique walked right up to this window. He's right in front of it. He's looking inside, and now he can see into the actual church. And it's totally ruined inside, but he can see where the pews used to be on the ground, and he could also see where the pulpit used to be, where the priest would give mass. And as Enrique stood there staring into the church, he kept leaning closer and closer and closer into the church until finally he felt like he really wanted to move away and get away from the church, but it was like he couldn't. He just kept getting pulled into this opening. And then as this was happening, the sound of the frogs got louder and louder until Enrique felt like he was totally consumed by these frogs. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church and back in the cemetery, Ana, Jorge, and Sophia were kind of laughing and walking around the cemetery, reading the different headstones, when at some point, Ana, Enrique's wife, just happened to look up when she realized Enrique was not there with them. And so Ana, she walked over to the gate of the cemetery and she looked up along the side of the church, and there was Enrique kind of leaning forward into this window looking into the church. And so Ana, she yelled out to him a couple of times, but Enrique did not even notice her or acknowledge her. He just continued leaning forward, looking in this window. And finally, Ana got right up next to Enrique and she actually shook his shoulder. And when she did that, Enrique kind of snapped out of it and turned and looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just had this totally confused look on his face. And Ana, she looks up at her husband and she's like, come on, come into the cemetery. That's where everyone is. Come on. And then Ana turned and skipped towards the cemetery. And once Ana was back in the cemetery, she just got right back to walking around and looking at all the different headstones. And at some point, as she was looking at one particular headstone, she took a few steps back to get a better look at it, and she accidentally bumped into another headstone, a big cross that had a line drawn across it, and it fell to the ground and it broke. Jorge and Sophia heard the sound of this stone breaking in half, and they turned and looked at Anna, and they kind of quickly understood what had happened. And Jorge, he just started laughing at her, and he said, "Oh boy, now you've upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together." Now, Anna was trying to make light of this, but she was totally panicking and did not like the fact that she had just desecrated a gravesite in a potentially haunted town. And so she began picking up the headstone and trying to put the stone back on top, but it was no use. It was totally broken. And so as Anna continued to fumble with this headstone, and as Jorge continued to laugh and harass her about all the evil spirits that were going to attack her because of what she did, Jorge's girlfriend, Sophia, who was right next to him, she started getting on edge, and she said, "Hey, Jorge, is it true that this place is haunted? I mean, really, is this actually a haunted town? I mean, what's the deal?" And Jorge, at this point, he stops laughing at Anna, and he turns to Sophia, and he goes, "Yeah, I think this place really is haunted." And then he would tell them the story of how La Musara came to be known as a haunted town. If you're enjoying today's story, well, I have exciting news for you. My long-awaited very first book is out right now. It's called MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, and it's shipping worldwide right now. This graphic novel was truly a labor of love, but I can tell you it came out just beautiful, and I think you're going to love it as much as we do. It has 4 feature-length, brand new stories, one of which you're listening to right now, along with 5 OG classic MrBallen stories that have all been reformatted and re-edited to fit this book. If you want to purchase a copy of this bad boy, just go to book.ballenstudios.com, or you can go wherever books or audiobooks are sold. And speaking of audiobooks, if you enjoy hearing me tell you stories, well, guess what? There is an audiobook version of this. And I can tell you, when I recorded said audiobook, I got really into it and kind of, at times, went off script, kind of dramatically so. And so it winds up being this really cool accompanying piece to the graphic novel, but it's also a really unique standalone MrBallen piece. So it's like a really cool thing to get that is not just a regurgitation of what you read in the book. It's its own thing. Again, my first book, MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. Go to book.ballenstudios.com or anywhere else books are sold to get your copy today. Back in October of 1873, there was a civil war happening in this part of Spain. And one of the rival armies was using the caves in the mountainside kind of near La Musara as sort of makeshift field hospitals for their wounded. And one night, a very famous general named Cercos was wounded in battle. He was brought into one of these caves, and that was where he died. Now, Cercos was a beloved leader, and so the people inside of this cave really wanted to give him a proper burial, but they knew they had to keep his death a secret, because if it got out to the rest of the men that their leader had died, it would be totally demoralizing, and it would really give their enemies a victory. And so the 6 people inside of this cave, they built a coffin and placed Cercos inside of it, and then early the next morning, when it was still dark out, these 6 carried the coffin with Cercos inside of it up into La Musara, and they buried him secretly in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 armed rival soldiers climbed up the mountain into La Musara to look for General Cercos. They didn't know that he had died in that battle. In fact, really, besides those 6 people that saw him die and secretly buried him, nobody knew he was dead. And so these soldiers actually thought Cercos was hiding out in La Musara. And so these soldiers began busting into all the civilians' homes in La Musara and ripping them apart looking for this general, and they'd send the people out into the streets and tell them they're going to kill them unless they give up information about where this general is. And finally, after about an hour of this, an elderly man who lived in La Musara had just had enough, and he stepped forward and he told the rival soldiers that General Cercos was dead, that he was buried in the cemetery behind their church. But the rival soldiers didn't believe the man. They said, "Okay, show us proof." But the elderly man said, "Well, I don't know exactly where he was buried in the cemetery. I just heard that's where he was buried." And so the soldier said, "Okay, get everybody over to the cemetery right now." And so all the townspeople made their way over to the cemetery, and the soldiers followed them. And then once they were there, the soldiers demanded that the townspeople begin basically digging up all the graves to find Cercos. And as the townspeople began to dig, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder, until finally the leader of these rival soldiers actually stepped away from all the chaos happening in the cemetery and walked over to the pond and began firing his gun into the water to get the frogs to stop. But they wouldn't. They actually only got louder and louder. And so the leader of these rival soldiers finally just gives up on trying to quiet down these frogs, and he turns around and walks back into the cemetery, and he finds all the townspeople have stopped digging. They've basically dug up every grave, and they haven't found Cercos, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. But the leader, as he looked across this graveyard, he noticed there was one grave that very conspicuously had not been touched. Everything around it had been dug up, but not this. No one had touched that grave. And so the leader said, "Go, dig that one up." But immediately the townspeople kind of took a step back and acted like, "No way, we're not going near that grave." And so finally, a townsperson actually stepped forward and said to the leader of these rival soldiers that that grave contained this old woman who had died recently, who everyone suspected of being a witch. And so it was dangerous to try to dig her up. But the rival soldiers did not care at all about this. They just raised their guns and demanded the townspeople dig that grave up immediately. And so they would. They would go over, they would unearth this coffin, and then the rival soldiers would pop open the lid. And as soon as it was open, everybody went silent. Because this woman, who had died weeks earlier, looked totally preserved. She was laying on her back and her skin was very pale, but it had not begun to rot yet. Even her cheeks still had a kind of pinkish hue to them, and her lips were open partway, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what really had startled the group into silence was this woman's eyes were wide open when they opened up this coffin. It looked like she was looking directly at all of them. And so after a couple of seconds of the silence from seeing this woman for the first time, the townspeople began to cry and scream and back up away from this coffin. And the rival soldiers, they were startled too by this woman's appearance, but they were more angry than anything else, because by finding this woman in this grave, it meant they had not found the general. And so out of frustration, the rival soldiers grabbed this old woman's body, this witch's body, and they pulled her out of her grave, they strung her up to a tree, and they just sat there shooting at her constantly until her body had basically been obliterated by all the bullets. And then finally, when the soldiers stopped shooting, they realized everything had gone quiet. Just a second earlier, the cacophony of these frogs croaking in the pond that had been so loud it was like totally overwhelming had now completely ceased, and it was like the town had gone absolutely still. And this stillness and quietness was so unsettling for these soldiers that they actually just turned and fled right there without saying a word to the townspeople. And then once the soldiers were all gone, the townspeople got to work reburying their dead. And at some point, one of the townspeople jumped into the grave where the witch had been, and when they landed in the dirt at the bottom, their foot actually sunk down an extra foot. They had landed on something hollow and crashed into it. And what it was another coffin. There was another coffin buried below this woman's that the soldiers had not seen. And this secret coffin belonged to General Cercos. When those 6 people had secretly buried General Cercos, they had just placed his coffin at the bottom of an open grave that was about to be filled with somebody else's coffin. They put it in, they covered up his coffin with enough dirt that no one could see it, and then the next day, the townspeople lowered the witch in her coffin into that grave without realizing General Cercos was below it, and then they filled it in, and then they placed a headstone on her grave. But because they thought she was a witch, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. And so after this incident with the rival soldiers desecrating this woman's grave and her body, La Musara was never the same. People in the town began dying left and right, and their soil went bad, so they couldn't plant any crops, and then all these insects came through the town, and then all these plagues of illnesses and diseases came through. And so it wasn't long before La Musara had developed this reputation of being cursed. And by the 1950s, that curse apparently had driven the last few people out, officially making it a ghost town. After Jorge wrapped up the story, Anna was just horrified, looking straight down at the ground, because it would turn out the gravestone that she had accidentally knocked over and broken, well, it had a horizontal line etched across the middle of it. It was the witch's headstone. That was the one she had broken. And so suddenly feeling totally spooked, Anna was about to yell to Jorge and Sofia that she wants to leave now when she happened to glance over at the base of one of the cemetery walls and she saw the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom, the exact type she knew her husband was looking for. And so Anna walked over, she picked this mushroom, and she turned around to show it to Enrique, but Enrique was not in the cemetery. And so right away, Anna thought, wait, did my husband ever actually follow me back down into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he followed her, but she wasn't sure. And so Anna yelled out for Enrique, but he never called back. And so she turned and looked over at Sofia and Jorge, who she could barely see through the fog, and she asked them, hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? And they both said, no, we have no idea. And so Anna, who at this point was now really starting to panic because this whole situation in La Musara was getting pretty spooky for her, and so she just dropped the mushroom and took off running out of the cemetery. Now, Sofia and Jorge did not really know what was going on. They didn't understand the urgency that Anna was feeling to find Enrique, and so they saw her take off to go find Enrique, and they just kind of casually walked on after her. And when they turned the corner and they exited the cemetery and began walking basically alongside the church, now again, the visibility is terrible from all this fog, as they moved along, they couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear Anna calling out for Enrique over and over again. And as they moved, Sofia and Jorge, they would see these shadows moving around in the fog. And they would think it was Enrique or Anna, but as they got up to where these shadows were, there'd be nothing there. And so Sofia, she began grabbing tighter and tighter onto Jorge's arm, and Jorge, who had been kind of joking about how this place was evil, was also now starting to feel a little bit spooked about what was going on. And so they began walking a little bit faster and faster in the direction of Anna's voice. And as Sofia and Jorge got closer and closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond began to get louder and louder and louder until Jorge and Sofia could barely hear Anna over the sound of these frogs. And then just like that, the frogs stopped, and all Sofia and Jorge could hear was the sound now of Anna crying. Now, Jorge and Sofia could not actually see Anna because of the fog, but they walked in the direction of her voice, and they ultimately found Anna crouched down with her back to them right in the spot where Enrique had previously been standing staring in that church window. And so Sofia and Jorge, they walked up to Anna and they reached down and they put their hands on her shoulder. And when Anna turned around, she was clutching Enrique's wicker basket containing all of his mushrooms. And with tears coming down Anna's eyes, she would say to her friends, "He's gone." Anna, Jorge, and Sofia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in La Musara. Remember, there's no visibility from the fog, and now it's getting dark, and so it's really hard to conduct a search for someone. And so after this hour was up, even though they had no idea where Enrique was or what happened to him, the friends decided that their best and really only move was to leave and go tell authorities. And when they did that, a massive search was launched all around La Musara for the next week. But despite this huge effort, nobody ever found any trace of Enrique. He just vanished, leaving behind that wicker basket that Anna had found. And so after this week of searching, the authorities finally called it off and told Anna that, most likely her husband must have wandered off and died somewhere, and at some point, hikers will likely discover his body. But Anna could not accept this conclusion, and so she continued to go back to La Musara to look for Enrique. And in January of 1992, so 3 months after Enrique had gone missing, Anna, Sofia, and Jorge returned to La Musara to do another one of these additional searches. And during the search, the friends were walking past the church, and they passed by that same window where Enrique had been standing looking inside, and also where his basket had been found by Anna. And the three friends, as they passed by, they happened to see into the church, and down on the main floor where the pews used to be and where the pulpit used to be, there were these 6 dark figures wearing robes standing in a circle, not appearing to be doing anything but just standing there. And immediately, Anna actually was really annoyed because she figured this must be a group of ghost hunters that were out here looking for something paranormal, because after Enrique went missing, his story made the news largely because he went missing in a town that's long been regarded as being haunted. And so because of his case, you had all these people coming to La Musara to go find ghosts or find whatever happened to Enrique. And so Anna, who was deeply offended by all these people who were coming out to La Musara to look for ghosts, because for Anna, this is not a game. Her husband really went missing here. So she goes right up to the window to tell these 6 people in robes off, get the hell out of here and have some respect. But when she went to the window and was about to yell in, one of the robed figures suddenly turned and looked up at Anna. And immediately Anna backed up because this clearly was not some ghost hunter, because the hooded figure had no face. It was just a dark hole looking back up at Anna. But even though there were no eyes, Anna could tell this thing, this entity, was staring right at her. But before Anna, Sofia, or Jorge could react to what they were seeing inside of this church, from behind them, they suddenly heard this unbelievably loud galloping sound, like all these horses were charging towards them. And at the same time, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder. And so Anna, Sofia, and Jorge turned around to see what was going on, kind of expecting to see, a cavalry approaching or something. But there was nothing. All they saw was the fog on the road. And so the 3 friends turned back around to look back into the church, and now these 6 hooded figures were gone. And so suddenly thinking that these figures had left the church and they were coming to get them, the 3 friends did not wait any longer. They turned and just sprinted out of La Musara. Enrique was never found. His wife, his friends, the authorities, they still have no idea what happened to him. There have also been several other people who have gone missing in La Musara, and they too have never been found. Just a reminder, my very first book, MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. You can find it wherever books or audiobooks are sold. This book is truly a brand new experience for anybody who's a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. We've never had a book before, so this is a big deal. It's a collection of 9 stories. Some are new, some are old, but they're all awesome. The artwork is incredible. The storytelling is just superb. So if you have not purchased your copy yet, or you haven't bought it for one of your friends yet, come on. Go to book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books are sold and get a copy today. Again, that is book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books or audiobooks are sold to get your copy of our first book today. So that's going to do it. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, remember we have a whole slew of strange, dark, and mysterious shows. We have the MrBallen podcast, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Runful, Bedtime Stories, and Wartime Stories. They are all excellent, they are all free, and available on all podcast platforms. All you have to do is just look up Ballen Studios wherever you like to listen to podcasts, and boom, you can find them all and start your binge. Thank you very much. Until next time, see ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Guys, it's a collection of 5 stories, and the very first story you'll hear is a brand new story, and the other 4 are fan favorites. Now, those 4 fan favorites have all been re-edited for today's episode, so even if you've seen or heard them before, this will feel like a new viewing experience. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is writing something very important, go up and nudge their elbow. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of September 15th, 2016, an 80-year-old widow named Rita Wolfenson shuffled her way into her kitchen inside of her brick home in Brooklyn, New York. However, Rita was basically blind, and as she made her way into the kitchen, she walked past her table and her foot caught a basket of newspapers on the ground, and it caused her to stumble and fall to the floor. And the second she hit the ground, she heard a pop. And the second she heard that pop, she felt a shooting pain in her hip, and she knew right away, very likely her hip was broken. Now, of course, this is a huge problem if you break your hip, but for Rita in particular, this was a very, very serious problem. I mean, this was potentially life and death, and she knew it, and she also knew the reason this was so serious was all her fault. Rita lived completely alone and basically had cut off everybody in her life. For like 20 years, she had not interacted with virtually anybody in her life by choice. And basically the reason for this all started 20 years earlier with her beloved son, Louis, who lived with her. But for some reason, 20 years ago, so basically right at the time when she cut off her whole family and all her friends, her son Louis just kind of inexplicably packed up and left her house without saying anything, and then she never heard from him again. And so suddenly losing her son for reasons unknown sent Rita into this spiraling depression, and the way she coped with it was basically cutting off the entire world around her, and she just lived in this house, totally isolated, totally alone. And so now here she is, stuck on the kitchen floor with a broken hip, unable to get up or call for help, and nobody is going to come by to help her. Nobody even knows she's in trouble. She's all alone. But despite basically being blind and knowing she's in this horrible situation, somewhere deep down, Rita finds this inner strength. She knows that if she's going to survive this, she has to save herself. And so she kind of rolled over onto her other side, despite the pain in her hip throbbing the whole time. She got herself onto her elbows, and she began low-crawling her way towards the coffee table in the living room that was right near the kitchen. And she finally got over there. The whole time she's got this horrible pain on her side. She gets to the table, she reaches up, and she grabs her phone, which she basically never used because she didn't talk to anybody or take any phone calls. But she managed to get the receiver off the cradle, and she dialed 911. And so a few minutes later, the ambulance arrives at Rita's house. They come in, they find Rita, she's still on the ground. They scoop her up, they put her in the ambulance, and they go to the hospital. And when they get there, very quickly, they put Rita through a bunch of scans and tests, and they confirmed, what Rita was already expecting, which is, her hip is broken. However, after telling her about the fact that her hip was broken, the nurses and doctors told Rita that, you're going to have to stay here for surgery, but then after you get out of surgery, you can't just go home. You're legally blind, you're very frail, and you don't live with anyone, and you nearly died from falling on your kitchen floor because had you not been able to reach your phone, you would have starved to death. And so we can't just send you home. You're going to need to think about potentially moving into assisted living or living with a relative or having somebody come and live with you. And so they told Rita that what she would need to do is move into an assisted living home where basically nurses and a medical team would be able to care for her on a day-to-day basis. Basically, she wasn't going to be allowed to move back into her beloved home where she'd spent her whole life. And for Rita, this news was just unbelievably devastating. I mean, not only because that was her home, that's where she spent all her time, but also because it was the last place she had been before Louis had left inexplicably. I mean, 20 years later, she's still dealing with the trauma of losing her son. And that house was kind of like the last memory of her son. I mean, his bedroom had basically been untouched since he left because she was so holding on to his memory. And so after the nurses and doctors left, Rita was left in the room all alone, kind of unsure what to do. And it dawned on her she would need to do something that for 20 years she had completely avoided doing. She would need to call her family. And so she grabbed the phone, and she still remembered the number of her younger brother, Joseph, and so she called Joseph up. Now, the reason she called Joseph is, over the past 20 years, the one family member who had basically tried really hard to stay in touch with Rita after she cut everybody off was Joseph. And so she figured if there was anybody in her family who would not judge her for the silence and, being cut off, it would be Joseph. And so a couple of seconds later, a phone rang inside of a house pretty far away from the hospital, but still in New York. And this was Joseph's house, and he was sitting on the couch reading a book, and his wife was in the kitchen doing her thing. And Joseph, he answers the phone, and when he hears Rita's voice, he couldn't believe it. He was shocked to hear her after so many years. But immediately the feeling he had was relief. He and his sister, before, Louis had left and kind of destroyed Rita's life, Joseph and his older sister had been very close. And it had really broken his heart when Rita had cut him off. I mean, he felt like if there was one person that Rita would have stayed in touch with, it would have been him. But he didn't judge her. He was ready to hear whatever she had to say because obviously something big had to have happened for her to call him. And so he asked her, what's going on? What's going on? And Rita would explain, she fell and she needs help. And Joseph was like, I will be there as soon as I possibly can. And also I'll have my wife swing by your house to grab, your toothbrush and some toiletries and a couple of things from home to make your stay at the hospital a bit better. But we're going to get through this. I'll be there as soon as I can. A few hours later, as Joseph was making his way to the hospital to see Rita, Joseph's wife was on her way to Rita's house to pick up her things. And so she pulled up in front of the house and she looked up at the big brick house and it looked the same as it had, 10, 20 years ago. She made her way up to the door. She didn't knock because she knew nobody was home. And so she used the key that Joseph gave her. She unlocked the door. She opened it up and immediately she was hit with this horrible smell. So Rita was basically a hoarder, and so she had lots of, plates of food and all this stuff just kind of jammed inside of her house, and it was all rotting, and so her house really smelled horrible. Not to mention, Rita basically never went outside. Remember, she kind of was a hermit for the past 20 years. And so Joseph's wife was kind of bracing for a pretty disgusting living situation, but this was far more repulsive than even she had braced for. But she knew she had a job to do, get in there and get some things for Rita. And so she kind of began breathing through her mouth only to avoid the smell. And so she stepped into the house, which again, is piled high on either side of the hallway with newspapers and just kind of junk. And so she began walking through the house and she eventually turned toward a flight of stairs. She went up to the second floor, and the second floor is the same as the first floor. There's plates of food and junk and all this stuff. And she didn't know which bedroom was Rita's. So she just went to the first door that she saw, and she opened it up, kind of hoping that maybe this would be Rita's bedroom. But the second she opened up that door, not only was she hit with more horrible smells, but she saw something in this room that she was not braced for, something that terrified her to the point where she shut the door, turned around, and sprinted out of the house, practically screaming. And then as soon as she was outside, she dialed 911. It would turn out Rita's understanding of what actually transpired 20 years earlier with Louis inexplicably leaving, the event that basically caused Rita to shut down and cut her whole family off, her understanding of that was totally wrong. Rita had always believed that her son had just kind of stopped loving her or didn't like her anymore or something, like there was some sort of falling out, and that's why he had just kind of packed up his stuff and left without even saying goodbye. But that wasn't true. Louis loved his mother. He didn't just randomly abandon her, but 20 years earlier, when Louis was 29 years old, while he was still living with Rita in her house, he died somewhat unexpectedly from natural causes. It's believed he had some sort of terminal illness that he may or may not have known about, and it's unclear if he even communicated that he was sick or that he had this illness to his mom. And so 20 years earlier, he went into his bedroom one night and he passed away in his bed. And his mother, Rita, instead of going into his bedroom and checking on him, just didn't go into his bedroom and instead convinced herself that her son must have abandoned her because he didn't love her anymore, and it sent her into this spiraling depression and she cut off her whole family, when in reality, Louis had never left her house. He was still laying in his bed upstairs all those 20 years. And so when Joseph's wife went into Rita's house and went into that first bedroom she saw on the second floor, what she saw was Louis's skeleton, still wearing a shirt and pants, laying in his bed, obviously deceased. And that's why she went running out of the house and called 911. And so in a very bizarre and morbid way, it was this discovery by Joseph's wife that would ultimately bring Rita back together again with her family. On February 27, 2015, 18-year-old Dalen Pua was visiting his grandmother on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Dalen, who was a Hawaiian native himself, didn't spend much time in Oahu with his grandmother, and since he was here, he figured he would do the one thing he had always wanted to do, which was to climb the island's very famous and very illegal Haiku Stairs, or better known as the Stairway to Heaven. These stairs were a very narrow, rusty, not well-maintained 4,000-step staircase that weaved its way up the side of this Hawaiian mountain. It was built during World War II by the United States Navy because they wanted access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view. But it was so dangerous and it was not well maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987 and literally put a fence up and even put guards out to keep people from going in. But Dalen really wanted to do this. So that morning he tells his grandmother that he's thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike. And his grandmother's like, that's a horrible idea. Not only is it dangerous, but they're going to fine you thousands of dollars if they catch you doing that. Dalen backed down from what he said and he said, okay, I won't go. And he kind of played it off like, I'm not going to go on this hike. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and he made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal and he was incriminating himself, he was so excited about going on this hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. And so the first picture begins with him at the base of the stairs where he posts a picture as he's about to start this hike. And then all morning he's taking pictures along the way up these 4,000 stairs. But then around 11 a.m. that morning, the posting stops abruptly and he hasn't reached the summit. And you figure if you're going to do this hike and you're already posting pictures of just the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you're going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post all of those because that's the prize at the end of this hike. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly hadn't reached the summit yet. And by that night, when he didn't come home, the family was really concerned and they told police. Police launched this huge search for him. They're looking all over the stairs. They got helicopters out. The Navy gets involved. There's no sign of him. He's just vanished. When they couldn't find him after several days, they had to call the search off, and the assumption was, well, you're doing something dangerous. There's a reason this is off limits. He probably slipped at some point and fell down the mountain. That's why this is off limits. It's not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something in this picture. This shot looks like he's just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down a little ways down the trail that appears to be hiding. And many people believe that that guy was following Dalen and at some point attacked him. That Dalen didn't fall off the mountain, he was abducted or killed. To this day, Dalen has never been found and that mystery man has never been identified. Growing up, Colton Louder was a joy to be around. He was always goofing off and making people smile, and he had a really infectious laugh. But secretly, he was depressed and began self-medicating at a very young age. By the time he was 18, he was a full-fledged drug addict, and by the time he was 25, he was in jail on a life sentence for murdering his uncle over a drug-related dispute. Colton's actions had a profound impact on his family, but none more so than on his twin sister, Kaylin. She had known about his pain even when he was putting on that facade of being happy and bubbly and outgoing, and she had reached out to him and tried to help him, but she could never get through to him, and when he was ultimately convicted, it was crushing to her. She felt like she couldn't help someone who was really vulnerable. But instead of just feeling bad about this, she took her sadness about her brother and watching him spiral and turned that into a laser focus on helping other vulnerable people that were struggling with addiction and depression to try to help them before they end up like her brother. And eventually she would get her degree in social work from Utah State. But despite Kaylin's best intentions to want to help as many people as she could, she found it very difficult to find work in her field, and it wasn't uncommon for her to have fairly long stretches of unemployment. And it was during one of those long stretches in 2014 that Kaylin's life rapidly fell apart, and it left everybody who knew her thinking, what just happened? On September 26, 2014, a little after 9 p.m., Kaylin calls 911. She reported that there was this huge, brutal fight taking place in her condo's clubhouse. Basically, it was like a restaurant where you could rent it out in the first floor of this condo complex. And she said it was getting out of hand and police needed to come over here and stop it before someone got hurt. The police asked her if weapons were involved. Were people using weapons in this fight? And Kaylin says yes. Guns. But when police rush to the scene, bracing for the worst, they discover that it's just a docile wedding reception happening inside of this clubhouse, and not one person in there reported any altercation happening. They were like, we're being pretty quiet. I don't know where she would have got that from. One guest would tell police that they had lit off a single firecracker, but they showed them what they had used, and they were these little tiny cheap things that made almost no noise. So it is possible that Kaylin could have mistaken that for a gunshot, but it does seem highly unlikely. Police leave, and then 1 hour later, Kaylin calls 911 again, but she immediately hangs up as soon as an operator has actually answered the phone. And the operator calls the number back, and Kaylin picks the phone up, but she's not really speaking. She's mumbling, she sounds confused, and the operator said, hey, you tried to call 911 a minute ago. Is everything okay? Can you tell me where you are? And Kaylin would have a really hard time giving her address to the police. It was like she couldn't remember her address. And she's mumbling, and at some point she says, my roommate thinks I'm delusional and paranoid, but I'm not. Kaylin eventually kind of calmed down and said she was sorry for calling 911, and the operator said okay, and they hung up, and that was the end of the call. The next morning, Kaylin calls 911 for a third time in 24 hours. This time, she's frantic. While she's on the phone with the operator, she's periodically screaming at these two people that are apparently robbing her apartment to get the F out of here, get out of my apartment, you can't be here. And the operator is trying to get more information out of Kaylin, but Kaylin is very distressed. She can barely communicate with the operator. She's half crying, and the operator tells her, can you leave? Can you go somewhere safe? And Kaylin says, no, there's only one way out. This is a small apartment. I can't go past them. And the operator tells them that police are on their way. Just stay in your bedroom. Don't go anywhere. And so while Kaylin is huddled in her bedroom and the dispatcher is still on the line listening, you hear Kaylin's roommate, Carol, walk into her bedroom and very calmly say, Kaylin, what's going on? And Kaylin's like, Carol, get over here. You gotta lock the door. Get in here. There's two people in here. They're robbing us. They're out there. They're in the other room. And Carol's like, no, there's no one here. The front door's locked. Kaylin suddenly sounds really confused, and she says, well, I can't explain that, but they must have been in here because I heard them. They must have had a key, and that's how they got in, and that's how they got out. And right at that moment, the responding officers show up, and there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing had been taken. It really looked like nothing had happened unless someone really did have a key. At this point, Kaylin was very embarrassed. She apologized to the officers. She apologized to her roommate, and she ended up calling her mom and saying, I'm mortified. I can't believe I just called 911 3 different times and nothing came of any of these calls. Like, I feel so embarrassed about it. And her mom, being a good mom, told her, don't worry about it. No one got hurt in the process, so it's all good. And so Kaylin moves past it, and on the call with her mom, she starts talking about what she's going to do that day. She says, well, I'm looking to update my resume and submit it to a couple different job openings, and I also want to clean up my apartment. And so they hang up the phone and everything seems normal again. But at about 5:45 p.m. that night, Kaylin, along with her beloved little dog named Phyllis that apparently she took everywhere with her, were seen exiting the condo and walking out to the parking lot behind their building. Kaylin was barefoot, was only wearing a tank top and shorts, despite the fact that it was cold and raining. And as soon as she puts her dog down, because she was holding her dog in her arm, Kaylin begins having this totally animated discussion, except there's no one there for her to be talking to. About 15 minutes later, she and her dog turn around and walk back towards the condo complex out of view of a camera, but residents would say they saw her crying and going up to a gate that lets you back into the condo, and she apparently couldn't open it, and as she's standing there struggling, she suddenly stops, puts her dog down, turns, and starts running away. And the camera footage we have of her is only when she's back in the parking lot, but she's running away still, and the dog is nowhere to be found. Her beloved dog, she's abandoned, she's got no phone, no wallet, and nobody knows where she's going. Later that night, when Kaylin's family could not get in touch with her, because of all the weirdness around those 911 calls, her family just had a bad feeling about it, and so they filed an official missing person report that night. When police arrived at the condo complex, the first thing they did is they reviewed the security footage. And they already knew about her 3 911 calls that had happened within 24 hours, and all of them had been for unfounded reasons. And they see Kaylin on camera, barefoot in a tank top and shorts in the rain, and she's having this animated discussion with nobody before running around and running away. And so police go to Kaylin's family and they say, does your daughter have a drug problem? Is she mentally ill? And her family tells the police, no, she's got no history of mental illness. She definitely does not have a drug addiction because of what happened to her brother. And they explain what happened with Colton and how that had a tremendous impact on her and how that had actually sent her on a course to help people with mental illness or people who are fighting against addiction or depression. And they explain explained how she was just really well adjusted and everything seemed okay until these 911 calls started, and now this. So this huge search is launched between the police and volunteers, and actually the Louder family even hired some private investigators to help them look for Kaylin, but days turned into weeks and there was no leads, no one knew where she was. She had just vanished. Then on December 1st, 10 weeks after she went missing, city workers were inspecting drainage pipes down near the Jordan River, which was a river that went by her apartment, and they discovered behind some plants a body that was half submerged, and it would turn out to be Kaylin's. They pull her out of the water and no cause of death could be accurately determined because of how long she had been in the water for. It looked like she had been in there for probably all of the 10 weeks she had been missing. They were able to determine that there were no drugs in her system and there was no water in her lungs, which meant she didn't drown. Her body was found 5 miles from where her apartment was, and so initial speculation was she must have gotten hurt and fallen into this river and drifted the 5 miles downstream to where she was found. But they looked at that section of the river between her apartment and where she was found, and the water was simply too shallow and windy, and it would not have been possible for a human body to travel that distance. Which means almost immediately after she ran off screen on the security footage, she covered those 5 miles, wound up at that section of the Jordan River, died, and then fell in the water, or fell in the water and then died, but not via drowning. The police officially ruled Kaylin's death an accident, but her family disagrees. They say if you look really closely at the security footage right before she runs away, it looks like she's terrified. More specifically, it looks like she's terrified of someone we can't see on camera. When she's having that animated discussion where it looks like she's talking to no one, further feeding the idea that she had kind of lost it. Well, there's this huge rock to the right in the video that kind of obscures our view, and behind that is this huge forest. And it is theoretically possible that someone could be back there that we can't see. But no matter what, her family believes that whatever she was doing in her final moments on camera is the key to understanding why she ran off and ultimately died. So you be the judge. Was this a psychotic break, or is there something more?
As many of you may know, aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my flagship podcast, the MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. And in addition to that podcast, we over at Ballen Studios actually have a whole slate of other incredible strange, dark, and mysterious podcasts for you to enjoy. If you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, check out my other podcast I host called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear somebody else from Ballen Studios with a far better radio voice tell you a story, like Luke LaManna. Luke has 2 podcasts under the Ballen Studios umbrella. One is called Wartime Stories, which sort of mirrors what he does on YouTube, also called Wartime Stories. It's like the strange, dark, and mysterious meets the battlefield. And he also has a show called Redacted. It's brand new, and it delves into government conspiracies and cover-ups. It's wild. Ballen Studios also has shows that are just pure nightmare fuel, like Bedtime Stories with host Richard Weil, who looks into cryptid encounters, supernatural deaths, the paranormal, and everything in between. It's really good. And then of course, we have Run Fool, hosted by the iconic Rodney Barnes, who's like a true pioneer in the horror space. We were so lucky to be able to collaborate with him, and his show, which sort of delves into terrifying folklore, is just one of a kind. You gotta check it out. So if any of these shows appeal to you, make sure you go check them out by just going to any podcast platform and looking up Ballen Studios, and boom, you'll see all of our shows. Make sure you follow along and tune in each week for new episodes.
In mid-August 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all 3 of them hopped inside and then then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist. He had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and doing whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, hey, I want to give you something. And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, no, I want you to have them. And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox. And so Sean is like, I can't accept these two things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. What's going on here? But Bryce would just say, look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you. And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim. At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They had just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus, Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely. He's abusing drugs and alcohol, and I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on, and she says, okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me. And so they hang up, and before Karen can even call Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend. And she says to Karen, hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him. It's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off. And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, will you please put my son on the phone? Bryce picks up the phone and he says, hey, mom, and he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, what's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely and, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here? And Bryce would tell his mom that, look, mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset. And, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment, but she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave? But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well, and it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing, independent of one another. And so she says, you know what, Bryce, look, I want you to just stay there and I'm gonna fly out there first thing tomorrow morning, and I'm gonna just see what's going on out there. And at this, Bryce immediately says, no, Mom, I have a lot to talk to you about, and until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here. And so Karen's like, what do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand. But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead she put her husband on the phone. And he asked Bryce, hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? Your mom tells me there's some problem. Like, what's going on here? And Bryce again just reiterates, look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now. And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave. And so Kim says, okay, I'll give him his keys. And then they hung up. And then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem, I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment. And Karen and Mike are totally relieved and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car insurance company letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought we need to call the police because something horrible has happened. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him. And let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier. And it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna Niguel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna Niguel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone. And so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who worked there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair. He's got a tattoo on his arm. He's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh, yeah, we saw him a couple of hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop, and we drove to that rest stop, and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop. And he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot And there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheel, staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side and he looks down to get Bryce's attention. And Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up, and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down and Christian says to him, "Hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You got to talk to them." And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, "Hey, he is still here. Here he is." And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says hello, Karen's like, "What are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you." And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, "Oh, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here." And so finally, his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, "Look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please." And Bryce says, "Okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now." And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, "Hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off." Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip. And so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, the police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrive in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass, and Bryce rolls the window down. And the officer would say Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he passed all of them. He even said, "Hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here." And so the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol. There was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, "What are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you," Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, "Hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay." And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. And he said, "Hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom." And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out. He dialed his mother's number and he hit call. And the officer said, "Give me the phone." So Bryce hands over the phone. The officer picks it up. Karen answers the phone. And the officer tells her, "Hey, look, I'm with your son. He's just fine. He's sober. There's no drugs. There's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's going to go home pretty soon. But there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on." And so he hands the phone over to Bryce. Bryce picks it up, and Karen says to him, "What's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic, and she told her son very gently, "Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just gotta drive home. You gotta leave Buttonwillow, you gotta come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry, I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier. And he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her. And so he was calling back, and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely? Because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no. After you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot. But, the police actually were just over there. They checked on him. And now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what? I'm confident he's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here, and if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time, Christian pulls up right next to him, he parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. It's the third time he's seen this car repairman, and Christian says to him, hey, Bryce, you need to go home. Your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home. And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, okay, yeah, all right, let's leave. And so Christian gets back in his car and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back, and he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. And then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone. He's still driving. And Karen tells him, okay, you're going to give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home. But Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, I can't see anything out my window. It's too dark and I don't know where anything is. And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you, Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home. You can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point, and it's the middle of the night, so it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, okay, pull over, but as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road. So Bryce says, no problem, I'll do that. And they hang up. Several hours later at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here. He's finally arrived, thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up, and it's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car? And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank and they say, yes, our son Bryce drives that car. The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. I mean, they looked everywhere for days and days and days. But nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough, it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up this small access road until it reached a truck stop. And then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. That was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up his scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive, that after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge, he goes up to the truck stop, and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. And still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all this strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff. And perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was he said he needed to talk to his mom about. That thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone, that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was. Since August 30th, 2013, when Bryce went missing, no one has heard from him and no one has seen him. If you think you have information about Bryce Laspisa, please call this number now. Let them know what you know, because his parents, volunteers, the police, there's so many people still looking for him. And so any bit of information could crack this case. So please, if you have information, call this number below. In 1984, 19-year-old Timothy Molnar was living at home with his parents in Daytona Beach, Florida, while going to school for aeronautical mathematics. On January 24th, Timothy gets up and begins his day just like every other day of the work week, by going downstairs, having a bite to eat, and then taking his younger brother Frank to school. Once he dropped Frank off, he drove across town to his university where he had class, but as soon as he parked, he realized he had forgotten his bike, and that was something he brought with him everywhere. And so before class started, he went back home, he got his bike, put it in his car, turned around and headed out, and his mother would step outside and see him trailing away down the road, and that was the last time she, or anybody in their family for that matter, saw him alive. That night when Tim didn't come home, his family called the police. The police asked them, is there any reason he would want to run away? Is he in trouble? Is there anything going on? And his family's like, no, he's a straight A student. He's got lots of friends. He's super happy. He's well adjusted. He's on a great career path. There's nothing in his life to indicate that he would want to run away or that he's in trouble. I know he doesn't drink or do drugs. There's really nothing. So the police begin their investigation, and they start by looking at the family's credit card bills because they knew Tim had a credit card that was connected to the family account. And they found there had been a charge placed the same day he had gone missing in a gas station about 150 miles away. And so the police go out to this gas station and they find someone that had been there when Tim was there, and he was able to describe exactly what he looked like, what his car looked like. And the police ask him, was Tim alone? And the witness says, yeah, he was alone. He was acting totally normal. I saw him go into the store and then I saw him come back out again, and that was it. I don't know where he went after the gas station. So for the next couple of days, nothing really happened. There were no leads to operate on, and Tim wasn't getting in touch with them, so they just waited. Then on January 30th, so about a week after Tim has gone missing, Tim's family receives a letter from an auto impound company in Atlanta, Georgia. And the letter basically says, there is a car that's sitting in our lot that is registered to your house. You need to come out here and get it. And so the family goes to Atlanta, Georgia to inspect the car, and they walk up to it and there's nothing suspicious about it. There's no scratches on it. The tires are all fully inflated. They look inside and there's no sign of a struggle. There's no blood. There's no debris of any kind. But what they would find inside the car were Tim's credit cards, his wallet, his license, and other items suggesting that perhaps Tim is trying to ditch his old identity and start a new one. They also noticed a few very expensive items that they knew were always in his car were now missing. His car stereo, his toolbox, and his bike. Tim's family stayed in Atlanta for a couple of days thinking maybe Tim will return to this car, but after a couple of days, it was clear that they weren't doing any good sitting there, so they went back to Florida. When they got back, they looked inside of Tim's room a little bit more closely, and they discovered that none of his clothes had been taken. There was no suitcase taken. It was like he left with just the clothes on his back. They also checked his savings account, and he had taken all the money out, but left $10 in there. And the family believed that by leaving that $10, what he was really saying is, I'm gonna come back someday. But he didn't come back, and they never ever heard about him again. It was like he just vanished. A decade after Tim went missing, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about Timothy and his disappearance in hopes that the viewers would be able to give them some information about the case. And sure enough, a man named Stephen Cull, who was living in Wisconsin, called into the show and said, without a doubt, I know where Timothy is. He told them this story about how 10 years earlier, he was walking around this forested area in Wisconsin when he came to a clearing in the middle of this forest, and he saw this lump in the middle of the ground. And he didn't know what it was. It was winter time, so he couldn't tell if it was wood or an animal. And he walked up to it and he looked down and he realized it was this huge block of ice. And when he brushed the snow off the top, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Inside of this huge block of ice is the dead body of a young man. Cull would immediately call the police, who would show up. They would get the body out of the ice, but there was no identifying information on him, and he was very badly decomposed at this point, and so they had no way to identify him, and so he was buried and he was unclaimed. But from the second Steve saw that dead body in the ice, that image was seared into his mind. And so when the TV show Unsolved Mysteries put a picture of Tim up on the screen saying, if you've seen this guy, let us know, Steven's like, oh my gosh, I recognize those clothes. That's the guy who was dead in the ice block. And so the police go to Wisconsin, they dig up the body that was inside of the ice, they do a DNA test, and sure enough, it's Tim Molnar. Even though Tim's body was almost completely skeletonized at this point, the coroner said there's no sign of trauma to his body, none. However, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. To this day, we have no idea how or why Tim wound up 1,200 miles away, frozen inside of a block of ice.
The official MrBallen podcast YouTube channel is back. This channel is the home for our exclusive MrBallen podcast episodes that you can't get anywhere else on YouTube. Which means if you have not been listening to the MrBallen podcast on podcasting platforms to this point, well, guess what? All those exclusive episodes, all that new content you missed out on is now going to be available to you on YouTube on this channel. And there are literally hundreds of new stories that have only been audio only to this point. And so we're talking about a whole bunch of new content for some of you. We post at least once a week on this channel, so make sure you subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss an episode. Also, to further entice you to check this channel out and hopefully subscribe to it, I have hidden a behind-the-scenes photo of me inside of my studio somewhere on this official MrBallen Podcast YouTube channel. So go over there, subscribe to it, and find that photo. Now, here is a teaser from one of the MrBallen Podcast episodes. Enjoy.
Within a few hours of Detective May's arrival, the Watauga County Sheriff had already made a call to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation asking for help. And not long after that, the area around the snow-covered body began to fill with members of a state crime tech unit and an agent assigned to work closely with Detective May. It wasn't until after the scene was photographed, sketched, and processed that the medical examiner oversaw the removal of the body. And after one small scoop of snow at a time had been lifted off the corpse, investigators finally got their first look at the nude adult white male who lay underneath the mound of snow. The bare skin of the man's back was frozen to the ground. His wide-open mouth showed a set of straight white teeth. In his left temple, just below the line of dark hair that still covered what was left of his scalp, investigators could see a clearly defined circle where a bullet had been fired into his skull. And on the right side of the man's neck, there was a second bullet hole. There was no sign anywhere of the man's clothes, and no shell casings from the rounds that were fired, but the body was not completely stripped. On the man's left wrist was a gold watch, and on his left hand, he wore a heavy gold signet ring with a small center diamond. The only other physical item left at the scene of what investigators now knew had to have been a murder was a 16-inch long strip of electrical and masking tape, the same kind of tape that investigators would later find had been used to bind the man's hands and ankles.
To hear the full episode and so many other strange, dark, and mysterious stories that many of you may not have heard before, head on over to the MrBallen Podcast official YouTube channel and subscribe today.
Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Every now and again, I'll find a story that is just really upsetting to me. Now, obviously, a lot of the stories that I cover are all, quite distressing. But today's story, which is about a missing hiker named Mike Turner, it just really upset me. It actually made it really hard to film this episode. Not making that up. It's just I was too emotional as I told it. So consider this your warning that I personally believe this is a very upsetting story, but an important story that we would not be covering if there wasn't some real weight behind it. And I think the moral of this story ultimately is you really need to treasure your family while they're still around. And you'll see what I mean when you hear the rest of this story. It's just heartbreaking. But for those of you who are sticking around for this story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, given the kind of intense nature of the story, let's go ahead and give the like button a big hug for once. And also please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into Mike Turner's story. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1998, a 48-year-old, 6-foot, 6-inch tall hiker named Mike Turner stopped for a moment and took his bottle out of his backpack and took a sip. Mike was standing in a cluster of trees on the side of this mountain about 11,000 feet up, inside of an area in Wyoming called the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. The Fitzpatrick Wilderness is easily one of the most visually striking places in the entire world. It's like all of the extremes of nature kind of collided together in this one place. You have these massive, 13,000 foot tall snow-covered mountain peaks. You have glaciers. And then right below them, right at the base of these huge mountains, are all these lush green fields full of tall grass and flowers and animals running around and little streams and lakes. I mean, it's absolutely picturesque. In fact, some of the pictures of this area, they look fake. They're so ridiculous. But the real reason the Fitzpatrick Wilderness was known as this unbelievably beautiful place was because really it went kind of untouched by people because it was so hard to get to. I mean, basically the only people who stepped foot in this very surreal landscape were really experienced outdoors people like Mike Turner, because it took a lot of know-how just to get to this area and to survive in this area. This is a very, very rugged place. But Mike Turner was not content just going to the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. He really wanted to experience the true nature of this area. And so what he was doing while he was out there was hiking off trail. And so he's in this totally remote place, hiking around in an area that was not even marked on a map. Now, to anybody who has not done any compass and map navigating out in the wild, this might seem totally reckless. And to a degree, it sort of is. But it's something that people totally have a knack for. I can speak from my own experience. When I was in the military, we did a lot of compass and map navigating, like in the backcountry in Alaska and also in California. And I was terrible at it, but I can tell you some of my classmates definitely had sort of like an innate skill to understand where they were in relationship to terrain features. And then if you combine that with proper training and experience, I mean, these guys got really good at just being able to navigate with a map and compass. And so Mike was one of those people that really was an excellent navigator. And so walking off trail like this in such a remote place was sort of routine for him. Now, Mike was not some full-time adventurer. This was something he did that was sort of a passion for him. His job was he was a reverend at a Christian church in Idaho, and he had been for 10 years. And Mike loved being a reverend. He loved his congregation, and his wife Diane and his 3 kids. He had 2 daughters and a son. They were all super involved in the church. I mean, it was a great thing. But at the same time, being a reverend was a lot of work, a lot of responsibility, and a lot of stress. And a way that Mike had found to kind of cope with that growing stress of being a reverend was to go out hiking. He actually found, sort of ironically, that when he was out in nature hiking, he felt closer to God than when he was inside of his church preaching. And it was because he sort of looked at the world as this grand gift from God. And imagine being in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, looking at this unbelievable terrain. I mean, it looks like, God made this. I mean, who else could? This is so strikingly beautiful. And so with that as context, on this particular day that Mike had stopped to sip water 11,000 feet up on this mountainside, this was actually the 4th day of a 9-day pre-planned solo hike through this wilderness that Mike had been planning out for over a year. Now, even though Mike was a very skilled hiker and backpacker and survivalist, he knew doing any sort of really long solo hike came with a whole bunch of risks that only really come if you're solo hiking. The biggest risk being that if you get into trouble when you're out on a solo hike, well, you're all alone. So you better have a really good plan for what you're going to do if you get into trouble. And so Mike had come up with a great plan. He had spent that whole year mapping out this off-trail path he was going to take over these 9 days. It was a 60-mile trip through the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, and he drew out basically exactly where he expected to go on a map, and he gave that map with all the different coordinates and exactly where he'd be on each day to his wife, who also was a very enthusiastic hiker. And he told her, on the 9th day, you're going to meet me at this spot at the end of the 60 miles at noon on this 9th day right here, and I will meet you there and you can take me home. However, that plan had changed on that 4th day as Mike was sipping his water on the mountainside. And only Mike knew it because he had no way to communicate back to his friends and family. Cell phones were very primitive at the time, so he couldn't just call somebody. I mean, basically, if he deviated his plan, he was the only one who would know. Now, the reason why Mike, on the 4th day of this 9-day trip, decided to alter his course made a lot of sense. So even though Mike was technically solo hiking, he was not actually alone. With him was the family dog named Andy, who was a very good-natured black lab mix who loved going hiking. And over the course of the previous day and then into this 4th day, he and Andy had been up at elevation at about 13,000 feet, walking on some icy parts of the mountain, and Andy's paws were getting really raw from kind of walking on the jagged ice. And that day, on the 4th day, Mike had noticed Andy was whimpering and struggling to keep up when normally Andy was super energetic and running all around. And he knew that, my course that I'm supposed to be going on for the next few days is going to be going all through these mountains with all this ice. And I don't think Andy can keep up. He's not going to be able to do it. And so he had decided to side skirt the mountains to avoid the ice. And even though this path was definitely going to take him a little bit longer, it would still bring him to the same destination, to that same pickup spot where his wife and his family would be waiting for him. Now, Mike understood that by deviating his route, not only would his family not know, like they would have no idea where he was, but also this secondary route he'd be taking to save Andy's paws was going to take a little bit longer than the intended course would take. And so he knew he was not going to be there at the time he said he would. So he was not going to be there at noon on the 9th day. It was going to be maybe the 10th day or beyond. But Mike had planned for this contingency. He had brought extra supplies specifically if he had to extend his journey. And so he felt confident that even though this was a big risk, to take this path that nobody knows he's on, he felt he could do it with no problems. And so after Mike finished taking a sip of his water, he pulled a bowl from his pack that was for Andy, and he poured some water in it, and he placed it on the ground, and Andy kind of made his way over and began lapping at the water. And as he did, Mike looked down and saw Andy's tail wagging happily. And Mike felt confident, seeing how much better his dog was already doing, that this was definitely the right decision. Taking this secondary route was definitely the way to go. But as Mike waited for his dog to finish drinking, Andy suddenly stopped and then lifted his head up with his ears perked up like he had sensed something. And then before Mike could stop him, Andy just took off running into the trees and disappeared. Now, Andy was a playful dog that periodically kind of ran around on the hikes like this. But remember, Mike is out in the backcountry and he's deviated his path. He needs to be really sure of where he is. He can't afford to make mistakes here. And if Andy just goes rogue and he has to go chase after him, the opportunity to get turned around or lost, or maybe come in contact with some big predator that maybe Andy has sensed, were pretty high. And so Mike grabbed the bowl and took off running into the trees after Andy. And after going into those trees, he emerged on the other side, Mike did, and suddenly he was hit with this incredible view, kind of looking down towards this lake. And there was this huge clearing on this side of the mountain that was filled with these huge boulders, like boulders the size of small cars, and they were everywhere. Basically, the mountain, as it eroded, chunks of rock were rolling down into this clearing that was sort of at a slant down towards this lake, and it just filled the entire clearing with boulders, to the point where you really couldn't actually walk on solid ground. The only way to get from where Mike was and where Andy was, because at this point he could see his dog was making his way towards the lake. Clearly, that's what Andy had sensed, the lake, and he was going to get a drink or something. And so Mike knew to get to his dog, he would basically have to climb onto the boulders and jump from rock to rock all the way to his dog. And so Mike tried calling for Andy one more time to stop and come back, but Andy was on his own program going towards the lake. And so, resigned to the situation, Mike climbed on top of the first boulder and began jumping boulder to boulder in the direction of his dog. 1 week later, on the afternoon of August 9th, Mike's wife, Diane, along with her 3 kids and some family friends, stood at the start of a trail called the Big Sandy Trail, which was the designated meeting spot where Mike said he would meet his family at the end of this 9-day journey. And as Diane stood there at this meeting place, she kept anxiously checking her watch. Mike was late, and not just a few minutes late. He was a full 24 hours late. Mike was supposed to be there on the 8th at noon, and now it's the 9th, and he's still not here. But remember, Mike is a guy that did stuff like this fairly regularly. He was very competent out in the wild, and everybody knew when he went off on this journey that, of course, there was some variability to when he would actually arrive at the meeting place. Despite Mike saying, I'll be there on the 8th at noon, Diane and her friends and family all sort of felt like, well, I hope he's there at noon, but realistically, he might be, several hours or maybe even a day late, and that's okay. And so the day before, when he didn't show up at noon, people were anxious, but they were okay. Now, 24 hours later, and still Mike has not shown up, there's no trace of him, Diane and her kids and the family friends, they were starting to worry. And in fact, before Mike left on this trip, he told Diane that if for some reason he does not show up on the 9th, so 24 hours after he said he would be there, and it's past 4 o'clock on the 9th, this is the trigger point, that Diane should call the authorities and assume something is wrong and send out a search party. And so Diane is checking her watch on the 9th, and soon enough, it's 4 p.m., Mike's not here, 4:05, 4:10, 4:15, still no Mike. And even though she knew her husband said, now it's time, go get the authorities, she just couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt like it's such a huge to-do if you get a search party organized out here. I mean, that's a massive effort, super expensive, and she felt like the second she told authorities that like Mike would come walking out of the wilderness with a big story to tell and a big apology for being late. And so she convinced herself that, you know what, give him one more day, I'm sure he's bound to show up. But the next day, on the 10th, when still there was no sign of Mike, that morning, Diane did go to the authorities and she reported Mike missing. And just as she expected, a massive search was launched for Mike. But you need to keep in mind here that again, Diane and the searchers and everybody besides Mike has no idea that he has altered the path he was on. And they're going to be searching this massive expanse of wilderness that even with the best of conditions, knowing exactly where someone is on their route, I mean, it's so hard to find people out here. I mean, it's totally rugged. Things are obscured from view, from the air, from the land. There are areas you can't even get to. There's predators out there. I mean, this is a dangerous thing to be doing. And again, they don't know he's not even on that path anymore. He's deviated. And so, despite helicopters in the air, horseback teams out in force, hundreds of volunteers combing the area looking for Mike, nobody found a trace of him. And after 2 weeks went by with this huge search producing nothing, they finally had to call it off. And so, of course, Mike's family is just unbelievably devastated. They have no idea what's happened to Mike. Have you ever thought to yourself, man, I just wish I could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in live storytelling format? Well, guess what? That is now a reality. Because I am going on tour. I'm going to go to 15 different cities around the country and stand on a stage and tell some wild stories to anybody who wants to join. And these will be a combination of old school classic, MrBallen, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and some new ones that have not been published on any of our platforms. So some new stuff you can only get if you come see me live. But you gotta act fast because we just announced this tour last week and already tickets are being bought at a record speed here. So if you want tickets, you gotta act now. All you have to do is go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, there are general seating tickets, and there's also the VIP package if you want to meet this guy, okay? So that's over here. And for our VIP ticket holders, bring your graphic novel with you if you bought it on pre-sale, or you can actually buy a copy of the book at the venue, and I will sign the book during our meet and greet. So that's just for the VIP people. Bring your graphic novel, or you'll have a chance to buy the graphic novel at the venue, and I will sign it for you when we finally get to meet. So again, go to tour.ballenstudios.com and get your tickets now. I will see you there. Five days later, so 5 days after the end of the official search, we're now at August 28th at this point. A couple of backpackers were hiking through an area in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness that was actually about 17 miles away from the last known sighting of Mike Turner. Now, that was not when he went through the trees and saw the boulders. This was around the time Mike literally began the 9-day epic journey. Somebody had seen him in one area, and so where these two backpackers are is about 17 miles away from there. And so these two backpackers, they were aware that Mike Turner was missing because there were flyers up all over the place around the outside of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness at the beginning of all the trailheads and in town and all over the place. So they were aware of this, aware that Mike was missing and his dog was missing. And as they're just sitting there taking a break, this totally emaciated, ragged-looking black lab came out of the tree line, whimpering and looking like it was on its last legs. It was Andy. And right away, these backpackers knew that's the missing dog. And so they lured the dog to them with granola bars, and Andy came up and he ate, they gave him water. And just so you know, Andy would survive and make a full recovery. And so after these backpackers have Andy in their possession, they immediately contacted authorities, who then got in touch with Mike's family and said, hey, we found Andy. And so you can imagine the absolute roller coaster of emotion Mike Turner's family is going through. Now that they hear Andy is okay, Andy's come out of the forest, they're thinking, oh my goodness, maybe Mike is okay too. Maybe Andy can lead us back to where Mike is. Mike is this totally skilled survivalist. He's got to be alive out there. And so after discovering Andy, a second search was launched using Andy as the guide dog. They basically went to that spot where the backpackers found him, and basically Andy's family and some other volunteers allowed Andy to lead them back into the wilderness, hoping it would lead them to Mike. And so as this new search began with Andy leading the way, a separate backpacker, who we will call Brian, just for the sake of the story, that's not his name, but we're going to call him Brian, he was hiking through a section of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness not near where Andy was. This is a separate area. And Brian, he was not involved in looking for Mike Turner, but he was aware that Mike was missing because, again, he had seen all the missing person flyers, he'd seen the news, and when he began his own hike into the wilderness, he had seen at the start of his own trailhead a big flyer with a picture of Mike Turner and his dog saying he was missing. So Brian's aware of Mike Turner's absence, but he's just going on his own hike into the wilderness. And after a few days of solo hiking his way into this totally rugged expanse, he eventually reaches this kind of dense cluster of trees about 11,000 feet up on the side of a mountain, and he walks through those trees, and when he emerges on the other side, out in front of him, sloping down to a lake, is this unbelievable boulder field that practically takes his breath away. But that was not the thing that really got his attention. Instead, as he's taking in these boulders and this unbelievable view of the mountains in the distance and this lake, he noticed there was a man sitting on a rock fairly far across this boulder field with his back to Brian, just staring at the lake. Now, remember, this is like the middle of nowhere, and Brian certainly was not expecting to come across any other person on this journey. And so naturally he thought, okay, I need to go up and make sure this guy is okay, or if nothing else, I want to talk to him. I mean, this is a very rare thing to come in contact with other people out here. And so Brian began walking towards this guy to see what was going on. Well, that man was the missing hiker, Mike Turner, and my goodness, did Mike Turner have a story to tell. But to understand Mike's story, we need to go back 29 days to the point when Andy the dog had taken off running from Mike and he had gone into the boulder field, and Mike had emerged through those trees and seen the boulders, he's seen his dog, and he began climbing onto that first rock to begin making his way towards his dog. So Mike, he gets up on that rock and he begins hopping from boulder to boulder to boulder. And at first it's going fine. He gets about halfway across the boulder field. He's, yelling to Andy to stay put, and he's kind of making his way. It's all good. But then he reaches this one particularly large boulder that when he jumped onto it, it was kind of unstable and it began to wobble under his feet. And so instinctively, Mike tried to leap off of the wobbly boulder onto another boulder that was right nearby. But when he jumped, he sort of undershot this second boulder and so did not land on it and stay put on it. Instead, he kind of hit the face of this second boulder and slipped down to the ground. Didn't hurt Mike, he's just now on the ground in this small space between the boulders. However, unfortunately, the wobbly boulder right behind Mike, well, it didn't just continue to wobble, it wobbled to the point where it rolled forward and literally came to a rest against the second boulder that Mike had just jumped onto and failed to land on top of. Basically, wobbly boulder impacted second boulder, sandwiching Mike between them. But critically, it did not harm Mike. This is going to take some explaining, but it'll make sense after I go through it. Wobbly boulder had what looked like almost a U-shaped cutout on the face of the wobbly boulder. Like imagine a perfectly round boulder, but there's like a divot kind of sitting on the front of it. And it just so happened that on the second boulder in front of wobbly boulder, it also had a sort of divot on the face of it, kind of looking like a U-shape. And when these two boulders collided, these 800-pound boulders, Mike happened to be standing exactly in the position where those two cutouts wrapped around him like shackles. They basically pinned his ankles together, where he could not pull his legs up and out of this totally tight space that was just big enough to hold his legs in place. It was like he was anchored to the ground. But again, Mike is unharmed. His legs aren't broken, he's not battered, nothing. He just cannot move. Now, Mike instantly would have known this is a really big issue because he can't move these 800-pound boulders. They are 800 pounds, and he's by himself, minus his dog, who can't really help him with the boulders. And so Mike immediately just jumps into, oh my goodness, I have to find a way to somehow just move these boulders even just a millimeter, a centimeter would be enough to free his feet. And so he pulled off his bag, and one by one he pulled out every piece of equipment he had, including his camera tripod and his stove and whatever he had, and he did everything he could to try to pry these stupid boulders off of him, but they would not budge. And so after 2 hours of trying in vain to free himself, it dawned on Michael that he was not going to be able to free himself. The only way he was getting out of here is if somebody found him and rescued him. And so Mike, doing his best to stay calm, he pulled out his journal he had brought along for this trip in order to detail, his closeness with God and, what he was learning throughout this journey. And he began documenting what happened to him, to include, why he was in this boulder field, what he was doing when he got stuck, how he wound up in these sort of granite shackles, so to speak. He also very clearly in his writing was very much putting his faith in God to get him out of here. He wrote in his journal on this first day, 2 hours into this predicament, "I am in your hands, Lord. I don't know what I may face." The idea being, I don't know what's going to happen to me, but my faith is in you. I know you will help me through this. And so after writing this initial entry, Mike turned his attention to survival. Like not trying to push the boulders off, but trying to survive amidst the boulders as long as possible. And so he pulled out his blue sleeping bag and kind of wrapped it around himself to insulate himself. He got out his stove, and there was some snow in reach, and he began putting snow in his stove and melting it to create water. And he also pulled his tent flap over the top of him. I mean, he was basically setting up camp inside of these boulders. And that first night must have been absolutely horrifying. I mean, the temperatures dropped down to near freezing, even though during the day it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But that night he's in this horrible position, just trapped with his own thoughts, just hoping and praying that, God was going to get him out of here. The next day when Mike woke up, he wrote in his journal some more, and he began detailing his biggest fears. One of them was potentially having to have his legs amputated if he got out of here. The damage of losing circulation to his legs was scary. He wrote that he had food for at least a week, but he only had 2 quarts of water, and there wasn't all that much snow around him left to melt, and he was running out of fuel. And so he was really worried about not having enough water, even though, very ironically, he was like 25, 30 feet away from a lake, which he could have drank water from, but again, he's trapped to the ground. And so on the second day, Mike actually attempted to throw his water bottle, which he connected some rope to try to get it into the lake, to capture some water and pull it back to him. But when he threw it, it was just short of the water. He could not get it into the water, so he couldn't scoop any water into his bottle. And then when he tried to retrieve the bottle, as the bottle was being dragged towards him, it got wedged in some rocks. And again, he can't move, so he can't possibly fling it out of these rocks. And so he couldn't even get his water bottle back. And so by the end of that second day, Mike's tone in his journal began to change. It wasn't totally negative yet, but he began talking about how, man, I wonder what's going to happen when I run out of water. I wonder what my urine will taste like if I mix it with Crystal Light. So it was kind of like he was joking about the fact that he was going to try to make his pee taste better, but it also showed he was beginning to realize just how serious the situation was. Nobody knows where he is. He's completely off the beaten path. He has no idea if anybody even knows he's in trouble, and he's about to be out of water. The next day, so the third day of being trapped inside of these boulders, Mike would once again begin writing in his journal. And his tone seemed a bit more optimistic, despite the fact that he has not solved, this water crisis he's about to face. He's down to his literal last quart of water. But in his journal, he talked about how this whole trip he went on, this 9-day trip he had planned out, the whole point was to become closer to God. And he felt like, what? I've really done that in the past couple of days. What I wanted to achieve, having a really spiritual event here, it's happened like times 100 being trapped here. I mean, this is the closest I've ever felt to God. But you could just tell there was just an underlying sense that I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to learn from this experience. I'm not going to take stupid risks anymore. I'm going to be a better father, be a better husband, be a better reverend. I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to improve as a result of this suffering I'm going through right now. However, over the next few days that Mike continued to be trapped in these rocks with no help coming, his optimism clearly waned. He began to write that he was angry with God. He wondered, is this a punishment for something I've done? And he also thought, maybe I failed God, and that's why I'm here. But it was just clear that Mike, who was this deeply spiritual person who absolutely believed in a higher power, how could he be in this terrible position and not be getting any sort of help from God? How could that be? But unfortunately for Mike, his situation only got worse. On about day 5 or 6, as Mike was laying wretchedly inside of this horrible camp he had built, he noticed that he had completely lost feeling in his left leg. Like completely. It was a dead leg at this point. And even though he knew by this point how bad of a situation he was in, this sparked a new, very real fear inside of Mike that he detailed in his journal. He knew his body was actually beginning to break down, and still there is no help, no divine help coming in despite all his prayers. There's no one coming to rescue him. He is all alone. In fact, Mike would write in his journal something that practically brought me to tears when I read it first, and it just said, "So lonely, more than I imagined." I just can't picture what it would be like to be trapped out there. You're not hurt, but you can't go anywhere, and you're all alone, just slowly withering away. And your family, they're somewhere out there, they have no idea, nobody knows. It's just unbelievably devastating. The mental torture this man went through is just out of this world. But it just keeps getting worse. Day 6, day 7, Mike at some point actually dropped his journal, and because he can't actually reach it anymore, he just picked up whatever objects he had and continued writing on them, like his pocket Bible, and then also there was an instruction manual for his stove, and he would write in the margins, and his writing just continued to get more and more pessimistic and sad. He began writing about how intensely he regretted his decision to take the long route. He was totally setting him up for this situation. Nobody would have known where he is. And so he's hating on himself. He's still mad at God. Why aren't you here? Aren't you seeing how badly I'm suffering? I mean, this is a guy who's basically losing his mind with regret and anguish and just pure loneliness. I mean, this is horrible. But then on the 7th and 8th day or 9th day that he was stuck in these boulders, once again, Mike's writing on his random things that he wrote on took another turn. Not only was his writing becoming more and more illegible because he's literally dying here. I mean, his body's breaking down. He's exposed to the sun all day, and then at night it's freezing cold. He's not having any water. He's drinking his urine. He's got no food left. He can barely write. His writing begins to talk about his family and his children. At this point, Mike must have known the end is near. And so all he had was just the thoughts of his family. He began wondering, what his kid's life were going to be like in the future, because obviously the implication here is he knows he won't be there to see it. He'll be dead. And then in some of the last entries he would make, it was obvious that really Mike had turned back to God. Now he was back to approaching God with open arms. He was no longer upset or questioning God's plan. He was just ready. He actually wrote in his journal, "Fill me with peace, Lord. May my conditions not deny my love for you." And then he wrote, "I'm ready to die, though I'm missing my family." And then in his final entry, which must have been on the 10th day of his predicament, Mike's writing was basically completely illegible at this point because he's right on death's door. And even though you can't really tell what he wrote, at the end of this final entry, it says, "Love, Dad." It was like he was saying his final goodbye to his family. Then Mike took off his wedding band and he placed it on the rock next to him because he knew once he died and decomposed, the ring would fall off his bones and be lost in the rocks below. And he clearly wanted his family to have that wedding ring. So he placed it on the rock and then he prepared to die. When Brian the hiker walked up to the sitting man he saw on this boulder, he realized almost immediately that that was Mike Turner because he had seen the missing person flyers before he came into the wilderness. And so knowing this is the guy they're looking for and knowing he couldn't move him, he covered him up and then he took Mike Turner's wallet, which contained his ID. And then as fast as he could, Brian the hiker made his way back to the beginning of the trailhead and contacted authorities. I will say it took Brian almost 3 days to contact authorities, and he was going as fast as he could, retracing his steps. So that really gives you a sense of really just how remote of an area Mike was in when he passed away. And then also it would turn out that Andy the dog, who was leading that secondary search, he wouldn't find Mike before Brian would. But once they discovered where Mike had died and they checked the direction Andy was taking his family, it was obvious that Andy was heading in that direction. He was a faithful dog going back to save his owner. He just wasn't going to get there in time. And to close the story out, making it even more tragic, on the day that Mike left his wife Diane and his 3 beautiful children to begin this 9-day trek, after he left, Diane received a bouquet of flowers in the mail that Mike had sent that he knew would arrive after he had left. And attached to this bouquet was a note. And the note was written to Diane, and it just said, "Thank you for letting me live this adventure. Know that wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, I'm thinking of you." Hello, all you fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. As many of you may already know, we always have merchandise for sale at shopmrballen.com. But in addition to the year-round offerings that we sell on shopmrballen.com, periodically we'll do a big limited-time merch drop. And we have a new one right now. Dropping today is the new Lungy Most Wanted line. This amazing Lungy themed drop will have a t-shirt, also a tank top available, the Most Wanted Lungy design, as well as some cool stickers. But you gotta act fast because these things sell out quick. All our limited edition drops historically sell out pretty much right away, like first week, if not less. So again, just go to shopmrballen.com and get yourself some sweet, sweet Lungy Most Wanted merch. And if you're wondering, what the heck is he talking about? What is this lore around Lungy and the Most Wanted thing they're talking about? What is that? Well, you need to tune in to my next live stream on YouTube to hear that, or if you're listening to this post my live stream, just go ahead and click on the live tab on YouTube and you can find the video that explains the lore behind this drop. Again, head to shopmrballen.com and get your mitts on this limited edition exclusive Lungy merch.
Today, I'm going to tell you 2 wild medical mysteries. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to your wedding, but give them the wrong date, time, and location. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 1 p.m. on August 6, 2011, a 32-year-old seafood vendor named Carla Flores stood in the entryway of her home, balancing a tray of shrimp in one hand and waving goodbye to her 3 kids with the other. She told her kids she'd be right back, and then she stepped out the front door onto the streets of Culiacan, which is a major city in northwestern Mexico. Carla was going to deliver this tray of shrimp to one of her regular customers. She walked down an alleyway and then onto a main road and then eventually into a neighborhood with a whole bunch of brightly colored houses. She went up to one of them and knocked on the door. A man answered and Carla handed him the tray of shrimp. He took the shrimp, gave her a handful of cash. She thanked him and turned and headed back down towards the street. And Carla had made it all the way back to the alleyway right near her house when suddenly she heard this loud sound, and then before she could figure out what it was, this small, hard object smashed into her right cheek, and it hit her so hard she fell onto the pavement, and so instinctively, Carla reached up and she touched her cheek, and she felt a warm, wet liquid. She looked at her hand, and it was covered in blood. Carla tried to get up, but her ears were ringing, and she felt dizzy, and then suddenly, everything went black. 20 minutes later, a receptionist at Culiacan General Hospital watched as a man carried a bloody, unconscious woman into the emergency room. He laid her down on a bench in the waiting area, and then he just turned around and began walking back out again. The receptionist jumped up and chased after this guy, demanding to know what was going on with this woman. Who is she? What happened to her? What are you doing? But the guy just said, "Look, I was driving down the road and I saw this woman bloody in the streets, and so I brought her here. I promise you, that's all I know." And then he turned and kept on walking, and the receptionist went back inside to check on the woman. The receptionist looked down at the woman. She was unconscious, her mouth was hanging open, and the entire right side of her face was totally mangled. And then embedded in this mess on the right side of her cheek, basically in her head, was this weird dark-colored object, but she couldn't tell what it was, and she didn't have time to stand around trying to find out. So she called for help, and a couple of nurses came running out of the emergency room, and together they lifted this woman up, put her on a gurney, and wheeled her back to see a doctor. A few moments later, Dr. Gustavo Mesa walked into Carla's hospital room. He'd been briefed on her condition, but when he went inside, she was no longer unconscious. Now her eyes were wide open, and she looked totally confused. Dr. Mesa could tell Carla was having trouble breathing, and she couldn't close her mouth. But then, Carla began making this grunting sound. And at first, the doctor couldn't understand what she was saying, but then it became clear she was saying, "Rock, rock, rock." Dr. Mesa's first thought was, oh, she's telling me she was hit by a rock. That's what's caused her injury. And so Dr. Mesa leaned in and looked at her wound, and he caught a glimpse of what looked like a dark-colored stone buried inside of her cheek. Dr. Mesa thought, wow, she must have been hit so hard by this rock, this stone, for it to get buried that far inside of her face. He promised Carla he would get it out, but first he told her she would have to undergo an x-ray to really figure out where it was in her skull and how exactly they'd be able to get it out. A few minutes later, Dr. Mesa stood in the radiology department looking over Carla's x-ray images, and it was immediately clear to him and all the other medical staff that what was in Carla's cheek was not a rock, because the object was shaped like an oval, it had round edges, and it was perfectly symmetrical. To Dr. Mesa, it just seemed far too uniform to be a rock. But he didn't have a better guess for what it was. All he could tell from the x-ray was this object had broken Carla's upper and lower jaw and shattered several of her teeth, and now this object was stuck between her broken jawbones. Dr. Mesa knew it was going to take surgery to get this thing out, but he needed more information before he felt confident operating. So he ordered a CAT scan of Carla's head to give him a more detailed picture of this object. And when the results came in and Dr. Mesa looked at the image, his face went pale. He couldn't believe what he was looking at, but the proof was right there in front of him, and he knew he would have to do something, and fast. So Dr. Mesa ran to the nearest nurse's station and told the nurse to evacuate everybody from the emergency room. Then he grabbed the hospital phone and he dialed a military official. Less than an hour later, Carla was no longer in the hospital. She was now out in the middle of a grassy field, laying on her back, absolutely terrified. An anesthesiologist walked up to her and injected a local anesthetic into her cheek. And suddenly, the agonizing pain that Carla had felt ever since waking up in the hospital was now gone. But her absolute terror was not. Carla knew there were 2 doctors and a nurse standing by to perform an operation on her, but also there were 2 army soldiers just a few feet away from her, staring at her. Carla saw a doctor start to bring a scalpel toward her face, and she had to close her eyes to keep from flinching. She heard the soldiers giving directions and the clinking of surgical instruments. And all the while, Carla kept her eyes shut tight and just tried to pretend none of this was even happening. And after what felt like a lifetime, Carla felt a shift inside of her face, and it was the doctors and nurses pulling this object out of her cheek. Carla opened her eyes, and right above her head, she saw the doctor holding the bloody thing they had just removed from her face. It was a live grenade. That's why she was being operated on, not in the hospital, but out in this open field, because if it did go off mid-operation, it would at least limit casualties. And that's also why the military was called in to tell the medical staff how to handle this live piece of ordnance in the middle of the operation. After the grenade was safely removed from Carla's face, it was disposed of by the army soldiers. It's believed that the grenade that hit Carla was fired out of a grenade launcher. That would explain the loud sound she heard in the alleyway before it hit her in the face. Luckily though, the grenade's fuse that should have ignited and caused it to explode didn't work. So even though it absolutely was a live grenade, it didn't explode, and so it didn't kill her. It's unknown who shot the grenade, why they shot it, or whether Carla was the intended target or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Carla would ultimately lose half her teeth, she would undergo multiple reconstructive surgeries, and she would be left with a huge scar on her right cheek. But she said she was just happy to be alive, and she was forever grateful to the stranger who brought her to the hospital, and to the medical team and the army soldiers who risked their lives to save her.
If you don't know this, late last year, we launched a brand new, strange, dark, and mysterious show called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. And so far, people love it. It is a free weekly show where each week we explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. Topics discussed on the show range from obscure diseases and freak occurrences to totally weird medical mishaps that sometimes result in big, amazing discoveries and other times result in just unimaginable suffering and death. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you really ought to give MrBallen's Medical Mysteries a try. To start listening, go look up and follow MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on any podcast platform, and boom, you're in. You got yourself a new weekly show. But if you're super impatient like I am, and you can't wait a whole week to get a new episode, Well, with your Prime membership, you can listen to an entire batch of 8 episodes at once, because we release them 8 at a time on Amazon Music. Also, on Amazon Music, there are no ads. And if all this was not enough to sell you on maybe giving the show a try, well, then stick around at the end of this video and I'll play you a sneak peek from our newest episode of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. One morning in the spring of 1982, a mother rushed to the reception desk at the Royal London Hospital in England, cradling her 6-week-old baby girl named Claire. Claire was her first and only child, and like a lot of first-time parents, the mother was very paranoid about her daughter's health. And so anytime there was a change in her behavior or her appearance changed, it was like this mom rushed to the doctor. And that morning, the mother had noticed something very unusual on her daughter's head. There were 2 raised white lines that made the shape of a plus sign. There was one line that ran from the nape of her neck all the way in back, all the way up her head to her forehead, and the other line was horizontal, and it went from behind one ear all the way to the other ear. Now, this mother had no idea what these lines were, what they meant, what caused them, and so as soon as she saw them, she scooped her kid up and she headed to the hospital. Now, in the past, every time this mother had brought Claire to the hospital, the visit always ended with, "Your child is just fine." But this time, when the receptionist saw Claire's head and saw those lines, she immediately said, "Those do not look normal." And so she handed the mother some paperwork and told her they would get Claire to a neurologist as soon as they could. 15 minutes later, the mother stood in an exam room and watched as the hospital's pediatric neurologist, Dr. Farhad Afshar, examined Claire's head. And after a moment, Dr. Afshar stepped back and he explained to the mother that these raised lines on her daughter's head were something known as bulging fontanelles. So when a baby is born, the bones of their skull are not actually fused together yet. And the thin gaps between these separate skull bones are called fontanelles. And Dr. Afshar told Claire's mom that when a baby's fontanelles begin to bulge like this, it's usually because the child's brain is so swollen that it's beginning to push the skull bones apart. Dr. Afshar told Claire's mom that she had made the right decision to bring her daughter to the hospital. But he was clear that a lot of things can cause a baby's brain to swell and potentially cause these bulging fontanelles, and so in order to figure out what was going on, they would need to order a CAT scan. Claire's mom felt uneasy, but she said okay, and so they did the CT scan, and then a few minutes later, Dr. Afshar came back into the room with the results. And with a grave expression on his face, he told Claire's mother that he had some terrible news. Her daughter had a brain tumor. Hearing this, Claire's mom felt like the entire world was crumbling all around her. She was terrified for her daughter, and she had a million questions. But before she could ask any of them, Dr. Afshar said, "There's something else." He said that normally brain tumors are made up of brain cells. But based on the CT scan, it looked like Claire's tumor inside of her brain was made partially of fat and partially of bone. Dr. Afshar said he had never seen anything like this and couldn't even begin to explain it. But the one thing he did know is that whatever this thing was, it had to come out of Claire. Leaving it inside of her head could at a minimum cause serious neurological damage, or at worst could even kill the child. So Dr. Afshar told Claire's mom that she only had really one option. Claire needed brain surgery. Even though the operation was very risky for a child as young as Claire was, it was the only way they could figure out what this mass actually was, and it was the only way to get it out. Soon after their conversation, Dr. Afshar was standing in the operating room with Claire sedated, laying face down on the table in front of him. Dr. Afshar made an incision across the back of Claire's head. Then he cut a rectangle into her skull, essentially creating a small door. He opened up that door to see the bottom of Claire's brain. He delicately moved the left and right hemispheres of Claire's brain slightly apart so he could reach the section where the tumor was. And that's when he got his first glimpse of this strange mass. He grabbed it with a pair of surgical tongs and gently tugged, and he was surprised at how easily it began to slide out. And slowly it came into the light. And when Dr. Afshar finally got a full look at what this thing was, he was so stunned he just froze, staring at this thing that seemed impossible. And so after setting this strange mass aside, Dr. Afshar closed her skull, stitched her head up, and then sent her to the pediatric ICU. Claire laid unconscious in a hospital bed with her mother by her side for weeks. Meanwhile, Dr. Afshar ordered a genetic test on the mass he had removed from Claire's brain. And it turned out Claire was not an only child like her mother thought. She was actually a twin.
And the mass that Dr. Afshar had removed from Claire's brain was her twin sibling's fetus. Claire had an extremely rare condition called fetus in fetu. Fetus in fetu occurs in the very early stages of a twin pregnancy, when cells don't divide properly and one fetus becomes enveloped by the other. The enveloping twin looks like a single baby, but they're actually born with their sibling's partially developed fetus still inside of their body. The fetus in Claire's head was 5.5 inches long. It had 2 arms, 2 legs, but its head hadn't formed yet. And Claire's case was extra rare because her twin's fetus was found inside of her skull. In all of global medical history, intracranial fetus in fetu had only ever been recorded 18 other times. And it was thought to be a fatal diagnosis because to this point, all the others who had it had died. But after 2 weeks in the ICU, Claire woke up. And a week after that, she was healthy enough to go back home. And by 18 months old, she had fully recovered and had no lingering neurological problems. As far as the medical literature suggests, Claire was the first person to ever survive having her own twin removed from her brain.
In July of 1848, a 25-year-old man named Phineas Gage got a job working construction on the Hudson River Railroad in New York. At this time in America, railroads were being laid all over the country, and so lots of workers like Phineas were needed to blast rock out of the way to lay down these railroad tracks. And as it happened, Phineas was an expert in explosives. He had learned how to set controlled blasts growing up on his family's farm in New Hampshire, and then later in his life, he had worked in a mine blasting through rock. And so in addition to just being the ideal railroad worker for this time in America, when Phineas actually started working in New York on this railroad, his co-workers immediately started looking up to him. Phineas was extremely smart and energetic. He was this incredible conversationalist. He was charismatic and funny and a natural leader. And so just 2 months into starting this new job, it was no surprise to anyone who knew Phineas or worked with Phineas that he was promoted to blasting foreman, which meant Phineas would lead the explosives team. Phineas was so excited about this promotion that he went to a blacksmith and had a custom tamping iron made. A tamping iron is a long metal rod that's used to pack explosives. When railroad workers wanted to blast through, let's say, a big rock, they would start by drilling a deep but skinny hole in the rock. Then they would pour blasting powder inside, then they'd put a fuse inside, and then using this tamping iron, they would push the blasting powder and the fuse deep into this hole inside of this rock or whatever it was they were blowing up. And then once it was packed, they would ignite it. Usually, tamping irons were sort of rough tools that looked like crowbars, but Phineas really wanted something special to commemorate this promotion. And so Phineas had the blacksmith make this perfectly straight, smooth, 4-foot-long metal tamping iron, and on one end was a pointed side, and on the other was a blunted side. And this rod, it weighed about 13 pounds, and it was about 1.25 inches in diameter. And Phineas loved this tamping iron. He brought it with him not just to work, but basically anywhere he went. On September 3rd, 1848, so not long after Phineas's big promotion, Phineas and his explosives team were blasting through some rock that ran through a forest. And Phineas, he was right up front over the blasting site, helping them prep the explosive. His team had drilled that long, deep, skinny hole into the rock they were about to blow up, and then blasting powder was put inside, a fuse was put inside, and then Phineas took his tamping iron and began packing the powder and fuse deep into the rock. And the way he did this is he used the blunt end of his tamping iron to pack the explosives, which meant the pointed end was sticking out of the rock. And so as Phineas is doing this, someone behind him slipped on a rock. One of his men tripped or something, and so Phineas, with his hands kind of on his tamping iron, turned to the right to look and see what was going on. And when he did this, somehow his tamping iron that was inside of this skinny hole must have nudged against the inside of the rock, created a spark, and ignited the explosive inside of the rock, which meant the tamping iron was basically fired like a missile out of this hole into Phineas's head. It went in his cheek, up behind his left eye, up and out of his skull, and then shot 80 feet away, landing on the ground covered in Phineas's blood and brains. This happened so quickly that for a second after this thing has blown through Phineas's head, Phineas just stood there upright with his eyes wide, and then suddenly a geyser of blood began shooting out of the top of his head, and then Phineas fell backwards onto the ground. When Phineas's body hit the ground, he began having a seizure, at which point his co-workers, who were still kind of shaken up from this sudden blast, they rushed over and tried to kind of position him in a way that he wouldn't hurt himself. But I mean, they're looking at him and he's literally missing half of his head. He's covered in blood. And they're thinking, there's nothing we can do for him but basically wait for him to die. And so all of Phineas's co-workers, who adored Phineas, just stood there very somber watching their boss die. But eventually, Phineas stopped having a seizure, and then he opened his eyes and he looked up at his crew and he sat up and he said, "What happened?" Now remember, half of his head has been blown out by a 13-pound, 4-foot-long metal rod that has shot through his head. And his co-workers, when they heard how clearly he was speaking and how focused his eyes were, they couldn't believe it. How in the world is this guy alive, let alone having a coherent conversation with them? And so the co-workers told Phineas, "Please lie down, we'll get you help, lie down, relax." But Phineas, who still had blood also shooting out of his head, just kind of stood up casually and walked over to the railroad cart and signaled for his crew to take him back into town. And so the crew, they're looking over at Phineas, who now is literally head to toe just red from blood. Still bleeding, but less so, and he's just sitting on the railroad cart waiting for them. And so they walk over to him and they start the slow 1-mile journey into town on this railroad cart. And the whole time they're all kind of looking at Phineas, expecting him to die any second. But instead, Phineas is just kind of looking around with half of his head. And at some point he pulled out his logbook and carefully wrote down what time they were leaving their work site to make sure his crew was accurately paid. And then finally they reached town and Phineas was still very much alive and looking around, acting like nothing had happened to him. And the co-workers helped him to his hotel, and Phineas just sat outside on a chair in front of his hotel, just people watching, while his crew went and got a doctor. A doctor soon arrived, and he too was completely shocked at Phineas's appearance, but even more so was Phineas's eyes. He looked at the doctor, and his eyes were totally focused, like he was all there, totally lucid, looking at the doctor, waiting for him to come over and help him out with his little injury. And when the doctor kind of timidly approached Phineas, Phineas very famously said as he sat on his chair, "Doctor, here's business enough for you." Like everyone else, the doctor fully assumed that despite Phineas's miraculous recovery from this injury, that he would soon die from this horrific wound in his head. And so the doctor moved Phineas up into the hotel, put him in a bed, and then basically made him comfortable. Now, the doctor at this point was not trying to save Phineas. He felt like there was nothing he could do to save Phineas. At this point, it was like mercy. Let's make this as pain-free as possible for Phineas as he inevitably dies from this injury. But Phineas didn't die. He would break out of it and basically be okay again. However, his personality at first, after he came out of this state of delirium, was not really the same. No longer was he this funny, smart, charming, confident leader. Instead, he was this guy who seemed to have lost all of his inhibitions and was kind of childlike. He swore all the time. He would tell people he had these crazy plans he was going to go do, but he would never follow through with them. And he would tell his nieces and nephews these wild stories about himself that were obviously made up and not even close to reality. But overall, he was okay, even though you could see his brain pulsing underneath his skin on the side of his head that had been blown off. And within a couple of years of this injury, those changes to Phineas's personality kind of faded, and he really did become old Phineas. However, there was one unique quirk to Phineas post-injury that never went away. And that was Phineas's kind of unhealthy love for the tamping iron that had blown through his head. After his injury, Phineas kind of stopped making friends, and any friends he did have, he really didn't try to keep those relationships up. He didn't get married, he didn't have kids. Instead, the tamping iron became sort of like his best friend. He took it everywhere with him, even posing at one point with the tamping iron the way you would expect a couple to pose for a photo. 12 years after his horrific injury, Phineas would develop seizures, likely from the injury, and then he would die with his beloved tamping rod right by his side. His case changed neuroscience forever by showing that an injury to the brain could affect specific personality traits. Today, Phineas's skull and his tamping rod are on display at Harvard Medical School.
And now a clip from Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. The winter streets of Boston were cold and gray as Zara hurried back towards her apartment. She was eager to get home and away from all these people she couldn't trust. But as she ran down the hallway of her apartment building and approached her unit, she froze. Her front door was already wide open. Moving slowly in case there was an intruder, Zara tiptoed to the doorway and peeked inside. Furniture was knocked over, books and clothes were scattered everywhere. The place had been ransacked. Suddenly it hit her. Zara felt like a fool. Of course she'd been robbed by her own parents. She'd given them her spare key, and they must have come while she was at class. Zara knew they were in on the same game as all of her classmates and even her professor. Zara couldn't tell what her parents had stolen, but she was not about to let them get away with this. First, Zara deadlocked her door, and then she began surveying her apartment. She had a feeling that her parents had not only robbed her, but had also contaminated the place with some sort of poison. She rummaged through drawers and cabinets, looking everywhere, when her eyes suddenly landed on the refrigerator. Zara went into the kitchen and slowly opened the fridge door. Her groceries were still there where she had left them, but she knew something was off. Zara leaned in and smelled. Then she jumped back and slammed the fridge shut in disgust. She'd have to throw away all her food because everything inside of it had clearly been poisoned. Zara then picked up her phone to call her mother, Antoinette, and after a few rings, her mother answered. And Zara told her mother that if she or her dad ever came anywhere near her apartment again, Zara would hurt them. If they wanted this to get ugly, Zara wouldn't be the one to back down. Then she warned her mother to never call her again, and then Zara hung up.
Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please mail the like button a birthday card, but make sure you booby trap it with a glitter bomb. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One day in March of 2012, a 5-year-old girl named Maria sat on the floor of her kitchen in a city in northeast Brazil, eating an empada and watching her aunt cook some stew. An empada is very similar to the empanada in that it is a pie filled with meat, but the empada is the Brazilian version of that pie. Maria's family was actually known for their cooking, specifically their empadas. In fact, at this very moment, Maria's mother was out selling their famous empadas on street corners and in bars and local restaurants. Now, the family got by okay this way, but despite their notoriety around these empadas, they really wanted more. They wanted their family name to be respected, to be powerful. And so to try to make that happen, Maria's family basically worked 24/7, not just on making empadas, but basically in looking for ways to kind of grow and expand the family name. In fact, while Maria was sitting on the kitchen floor, she could hear her father in the other room working. And the reason she knew he was working is because periodically she could hear him yell out with excitement. He was basically sitting there coming up with ideas of how he could make the family name even bigger and better. And when he had a good idea, he would shout out and be like, "Oh, I found it!" And in addition to constantly sort of brainstorming for ideas of how to become rich and powerful, Maria's father also was an author, and he was writing a book that he was convinced was going to be another thing that would kind of ratchet their family up the social hierarchy. But because Maria's mother and father and basically everybody in her family were so completely immersed in work all the time, it meant they didn't really pay much attention to her. And so most of the time, Maria was just kind of on her own, usually playing in the kitchen or playing in the backyard. Just then, the front door opened and in walked Maria's mother, and she was grinning ear to ear, not only because she now had an empty tray, meaning she had sold all her empadas, but also she had brought someone along that she was really excited to introduce to Maria. Maria's mom stepped all the way into the kitchen, and right behind her was this young woman. And Maria's mother pointed at this young woman and then gestured for Maria to come over and say hi. And she told Maria that this young woman wants to become her new nanny. And so you guys can play together all the time while me and your father are out doing our work. Maria stood up and gave a shy smile to the young woman, but she wasn't sold that this woman actually would become her nanny. Because in the past, there had been other women who had come by to be her nanny, and they didn't seem to last very long. And so Maria was not getting her hopes up. Still, Maria wanted to be friendly, so she walked over and, as a gesture of goodwill, she handed this woman her half-eaten empada. And the young woman took the empada and laughed and said, "Thank you." After that, Maria's mother told her to head on out back and go play by herself for a bit, while she and this new nanny hammered out the details of her new job. And she told Maria that as soon as they were done, the new nanny would come outside and join her, and they could play together. And so Maria, who was always very obedient, did as she was told, and she headed out back and entertained herself. And the whole time, as she's just kicking rocks around and pulling grass up and just kind of doing what kids do, she kept looking back at the house, waiting for the nanny to come outside. But she didn't. And after a whole hour had passed by and still this new nanny had not come outside, Maria felt really bored. And so she went inside to go look for her. A month later, Maria was out in her backyard playing by herself like usual when she heard a commotion happening inside of her house. She looked over at the house and couldn't really tell what was going on. And then she heard the sound of her mother and her father and her aunt raising their voices like they were fighting with somebody. And then all of a sudden, these uniformed police officers came charging out the back door towards Maria. One of the officers came right up to her and asked her what her name was. And Maria was so scared, remember she's 5 years old here, that she didn't even know what to say. So she just stood there staring, being totally terrified. She had no idea what was going on. But as these police officers would soon tell her, it would turn out her entire life was one big, horrific lie. Maria's father, George Silvera, was not actually her father, nor was Maria's mother, Isabel Silvera, her actual mother, nor was her aunt, Bruna Silva, actually her aunt. In reality, those three people were not related to Maria. They were instead members of a cult called the Cartel Sect. And all these three cult members cared about was impressing the members of the cult. When they thought about, making it big, their so-called family name becoming bigger and more powerful, that was all in relationship to the Cartel Sect. They wanted the members of this cult to look at them as the most powerful and important members of that cult. And the way they tried to do that was by performing the duties of this cult to the best of their abilities, better than anybody else in the cult. And so what did this cartel care about? Well, the literal purpose of the Cartel Sect was to eliminate women they deemed unclean in order to reduce and purify the world's population. And Maria's family, the mother, the father, and the aunt, had become very well versed at doing this. All those nannies that came around to see Maria, well, the reason they kept vanishing is because shortly after the mother, the father, and the aunt introduced them to Maria and said, "Oh, she's going to be your new nanny," they would shoo Maria out into the backyard, and then they would murder the nanny because this person had been deemed unclean. They would cut their throats and stab them to death. But that wasn't all. That wasn't enough cleansing. After they murdered these women, they would then butcher them and stuff the human meat into their famous empadas and sell them to the people in town. They literally were feeding people in this city human meat. But the cult and the cannibalism and the murders were not actually the biggest shock of this story. The biggest shock of the story is actually the real identity of little 5-year-old Maria. She was actually the daughter of the very first victim of the Cartel Sect. The mother, along with Maria 3.5 years earlier, when Maria was just 1.5 years, they had been lured to this very house where her mother was murdered right in front of Maria. And then after her mother was killed, they cooked her mother and fed pieces of the mother to Maria. And ever since, they had just kept Maria and treated her like she was a member of the family, basically turning her into an unwitting cannibal. The existence of the cult and their hideous murders were ultimately discovered after they used one of the credit cards of their victims sometime in the spring of 2012. That's when all the cops rushed into the backyard and confronted Maria. George, Isabel, and Bruna, Maria's fake family, were convicted of 3 murders, including the murder of Maria's real mother, and they are currently serving what amounts to life sentences in Brazil. Police believe the actual number of women that they murdered is as many as 8. As for Maria, according to recent news articles, she was reunited with distant family. Maria is not her real name. That is a pseudonym to protect her identity. Are you the type of person who has binged basically all of my YouTube videos and every week you anxiously wait a new upload? If so, thank you. But also you're in luck. Because if you didn't know this, we actually have a separate podcast, the MrBallen podcast, that has literally hundreds of stories that are not on YouTube that you can binge right now. That podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Again, it's just called the MrBallen podcast. And on Mondays on that podcast, we upload exclusive new content that is not on YouTube to the podcast. So that's Mondays. And then on Thursday, we remaster the audio of your favorite videos on YouTube and put those on the podcast. But again, Mondays, those are brand new and exclusive to the podcast. But if you want to hear those exclusive episodes 1 month ahead of Apple and Spotify and all the other platforms, well, there's only one place you can do that, and that's on Amazon Music. So again, you can go to any podcast platform and find the MrBallen podcast, or if you're like me and you hate waiting, then you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. On January 23rd, 1989, a mother was cooking dinner in her home in Rochester, New York, when her 11-year-old daughter came into the kitchen. The daughter had just finished delivering newspapers along her delivery route in their quiet suburban neighborhood. And so her mother asked her the same nightly question: how was the route? And usually the daughter replied with just a good. But tonight was different. Instead, her daughter said, "It's okay." And the mother pried, like, "Well, what do you mean? What happened?" And the daughter said, "Well, I saw something strange." She told her mom that she delivered newspapers to this one particular old man. He was very nice and he always waved to her whenever she went by. And tonight was no different. He had waved to her, but there was just something off about the way he was sitting. The mother asked, what do you mean? And the daughter, she really struggled to articulate what she had seen. 1, it was dark. 2, the man was sitting inside of a screened-in porch that kind of obscured her view, and the awnings were pretty low, making it hard to look in. But she said basically when she had gone past, the man had waved to her like normal, but his legs appeared to be straight up in the air, like he was sitting on a chair and his legs were like up, vertical, right in front of him. In fact, when he waved, it was like he was waving between his legs at her. And so when the mother heard this, she really didn't know what to make of it. I mean, the story didn't make any sense. She couldn't really understand how this guy was sitting where his legs would be straight up in the air like that. But at the same time, she could tell her daughter was worried, and, she kind of figured that maybe her daughter's imagination had run wild here. And so she told her daughter, like, "Hey, look, if he waved to you, then I'm sure everything is just fine. Don't worry about it." But the following night, when the girl came back from her route once again, she was even more upset about this guy out on his porch. She told her mom that once again, she looked in the porch and there he was sitting there with his legs straight up in the air, except this time he didn't wave to her, including when she made a point to stop and wave at him. He did not wave back. Now, the girl told her mom that she was worried about him, and so she went right up to the door to go check on him, but the screened-in porch was locked, so she couldn't get inside, and, her view was kind of obscured because of the screen, so she couldn't really see him in there. But, she didn't know what to do, so she just left. Now, this story, which was already weird, now did seem a whole lot weirder that 2 days in a row, her daughter is seeing this. But the mother's thinking to herself, like, come on, this is just some older guy who loves this chair and, he's fallen asleep in some weird position here. And, my daughter is sort of exaggerating what she's seeing. Like, this can't be a big deal here. But again, seeing the concern on her daughter's face, she told her daughter, "Look, don't worry about it. I'm sure everything's fine. I will go by tomorrow morning and make sure he's okay." So the next morning, a little before 11 a.m., the mother arrived on the street where this old man lived. And as she was walking down the road towards the house, she actually spotted the mailman. And so before she went any farther, she flagged the mailman down and she asked him like, hey, is there anything weird going on with that old guy who lives right over there? But the mailman was like, no, he's just a nice older guy who waves at everybody who goes by. And so the mother thanked the mailman and did give some thought to just, taking what the mailman said and turning back around and heading home and telling her daughter everything's fine. But, she knew her daughter was really worried about this guy, and so she decided she would just continue down the road and check on this guy for herself and just really make sure he's okay, and then report back to her daughter. And also the mother was thinking, it's about 20 degrees outside. It's very cold. This is not really a good time for an older man to be outside so much. So what's he doing? Let's really make sure he's okay. And so the mother made her way down the road and she reached the old man's house. And sure enough, the screened-in porch really did obscure, whoever was inside of it. She could see a silhouette of what appeared to be this old man sitting there. But the first thing she actually noticed was not him, but rather the 2 newspapers that were sitting right on his walkway, uncollected. I mean, these are the newspapers that her daughter had left over the same period of time that she's seeing this weird thing happening with this guy. And so suddenly the woman's feeling like that's a pretty big red flag. And so she hustled her way right up towards the front. And as she did, she looked into the screen porch and waved at this old man to try to get his attention, like, hey, are you okay in there? But the man did not wave back. And so the mother went right up to the door and she checked it, but like her daughter had said, it was locked. And so the mother, she pressed her face up against the mesh screen that kind of had been obscuring her view from a distance. And she put her face right up against the screen where she would have a clear view inside. And when she did, and she saw the old man who was in fact right there, and he did in fact have his legs up, when she saw him, she realized what was actually going on. And the second she did, she jumped back, turned around, and ran away to go call the police. It would turn out the old man who lived there, whose name was Robert Ham, and he was 73 years old, he was not just eccentric and sitting weirdly on his front porch. Instead, on January 23rd, right before that little girl had come home and told her mother that this man had been acting strangely, on that evening, Robert had come out onto his screened-in porch, and for whatever reason, he had attempted to sit down on this trash can that was out there on the porch. But the lid didn't hold. And so Robert fell butt first into this trash can, folding him up into this V position where his legs were straight up in front of him. And Robert was too weak to get himself out of the trash can. And also because of being in this V position where his legs were pressed up against his torso, it was restricting his ability to breathe and to make any sound. And so all he could do in this position was just wave at passerby, hoping they would see he was in trouble and go help him. But unfortunately, nobody could really tell what he was doing, including the little girl on the paper route. They just thought there was this guy sitting in his porch in this weird position, waving to people, when in reality, he was dying. And so unfortunately, because nobody came to his aid, Robert did die. He would die of a heart attack, and in fact, by the time that little girl's mother arrived at his house and put her face up against the screen, Robert was already dead. At around 7:30 a.m. on September 25th, 2012, a 69-year-old farmer named Terry Garner stepped out of his house in rural Oregon to go feed his animals. He stopped first at his enclosed yard, where he spread some seed on the ground for his chickens and turkeys, and then he headed over to his pen, where he was raising 4-horned goats, which are goats that grow 4 horns instead of 2. And after picking up some hay and tossing it in with the goats, Terry just stood there and smiled as he watched the animals eat. Terry loved his animals. He actually had previously been a butcher for most of his life. But 6 years earlier, when he had retired, he had kind of gone the opposite direction, basically housing all these animals and treating them basically like people. In fact, he was so devoted to his animals that sometimes when the nearby river would flood, he would move all of his animals into this house he had built on his property just for the animals to make sure they were safe. And if you ever went to visit Terry at his property, it was pretty common to see a lot of the chickens and other birds just kind of hanging out on the front porch of Terry's house. He didn't care. He liked having them around. But of all the creatures that Terry took care of at his farm, the animal he loved the most were his pigs. Now, normally when farmers raise pigs, they grow them to about 250 to 300 pounds, and then they sell them to butchers to be slaughtered. But that's obviously not what Terry was doing here. He loved these pigs so much that he basically just fed them anytime they were hungry, and they were hungry all the time. which meant his pigs sometimes grew to be like 700 pounds, and at no point was Terry going to sell those pigs. He just wanted his pigs to live their best life. So on this morning, after he was done feeding his chickens and turkeys and the goats, he grabbed a whole bunch of food and began making his way over to his beloved pigs. A few hours later, a member of Terry's family arrived at Terry's property and knocked on his door. This family member had called Terry earlier in the day and Terry hadn't picked up. Now that in and of itself was not that uncommon. Terry was a busy farmer, but Terry always called people back. And so far he hadn't. And so this family member was here just to check on him and make sure he was okay. And so after a few minutes, when Terry did not come to the door, the family member grew more concerned about Terry and decided they would just walk the whole property and just go find Terry and see what he was doing. And so the family member left the porch and walked all around the property. They saw where the chickens and turkeys were. They saw the goats. They saw the pigs. But that was it. All they saw were animals. Terry was nowhere to be found. It was like he was gone. And so the family member was just about to turn around and head back to Terry's house to see if, maybe he really wasn't there, when suddenly something caught their eye in the pig pen. Now, at first, what they were looking at just seemed impossible. Like, how could that be there? That doesn't make any sense. But when the family member walked over and got a closer look, they knew for sure what they were looking at. And as soon as that truth sunk in, they turned, ran to the house, and called the police. It would turn out, earlier that morning, when Terry had walked into the pig pen to feed his beloved enormous pigs, somehow or another, he had wound up on the ground. Now, we don't know if he had a heart attack or if he had some other medical event or if he simply just tripped and couldn't get up again, but one way or another, he wound up on the ground, and at some point, his pigs devoured him. And so what that family member saw in the mud that caught their eye was not Terry, but Terry's false teeth grinning back at him. Those teeth, along with several pieces of his body and his clothes, were all that was left of Terry. One more haunting detail of this case is that officials were not able to actually figure out whether or not Terry was dead before he began being eaten, or if he was just sort of incapacitated and very much alive when his beloved pigs began to eat him. As many of you may already know, by far the most popular series that I do on our YouTube channel is the Top 3 Places You Can't Go and People Who Went There Anyways series. So we're going to continue to do that series periodically on YouTube like we have for years. But because this series is so in demand, we are also going to begin telling these stories in a brand new format, audio. Right now, you can head over to the MrBallen podcast on any podcast platform to find one of these exclusive episodes. The way you find them is you look in the title of the episode, and if it says "You Can't" at the front of the episode, that is this type of content. And so right now, there's an episode that's live, and periodically we're going to populate more You Can't style episodes on that podcast. The only reason we are not full sending this You Can't series on audio as a standalone show is because we need to gauge the interest on audio before we kind of ramp that up. That's why you're seeing kind of periodic uploads. So if you really want to hear more of this stuff, go listen to that You Can't episode and tune in each time we tell you there are You Can't episodes available. And if there's lots of demand, you'll see more You Can't style episodes, which again are very, very similar to the Top 3 Places You Can't Go and People Who Went There Anyways. So right now, go over to MrBallen Podcast and have a listen to the first You Can't episode. Enjoy.